The air atop Olympus is rarely clear. It is thick with the suffocating scent of ozone, polished marble, and fragile pride. On this particular day, the great council chamber feels less like a sanctuary of divine law and more like a gilded trap. At the center of it all sits the sovereign himself, draped in clouds and absolute authority, but beneath that magnanimous smile lies a ruler calculating his next move. He looks down upon the gathering with the serene composure of a man who believes the realm moves solely because he allows it to. Yet, across the grand hall, an ancient tension festers. The goddess of beauty, born from the primal foam of the ancient sky father long before the current king ever drew breath, feels the weight of his condescension. To him, she is merely a shiny new addition to his realm, a pawn to be managed. To her, his royal grandstanding is little more than divine arrogance wrapped in silk. The conflict begins with a single, sweeping declaration, a demand disguised as a royal favor. The king proposes a match, a union meant to settle the rising heat that threatens to tear the court apart. Jealousy has begun to poison the lower halls, mortal suitors and immortal admirers alike clashing in the shadows, all desperate to possess what cannot be owned. The king frames his intervention as a mercy, a necessary maneuver to restore order after endless squabbles over her favor. He speaks of chaos, of rising rivalries, and the desperate need for stability. But she sees right through the theatrical concern. To her, the realm was built on conquest, on taking what you desire through sheer force. Why should the game change now? Simply because her presence makes the powerful uncomfortable. Around them, the atmosphere grows heavy with unsaid grievances, the war-minded scholars glaring from the side, the quiet judgment of siblings and rivals, every god in attendance silently taking sides in a quiet war of wills. She offers a sharp, mocking reply, questioning the king's sudden commitment to fairness, pointing out the hypocrisies of a ruler whose own history is written in deceit and stolen moments. A silent standoff settles over the grand chamber. The king asserts his divine mandate, framing his decree not as a plea, but as an absolute command. A husband will be chosen, an anchor will be cast. She stands on the edge of a choice she never asked to make, trapped between enforced decree and her own uncompromising pride, bound to a fate that will soon send ripples through the heavens. The tension in the hall thickens to a suffocating frost. The king's grand smile fractures for a fleeting second, exposing the sharp, bitter ego beneath the divine mask. Mocking the sovereign is a dangerous sport, but watching his pristine composure crack is a pleasure too sweet to resist. Before the silence can settle, a new voice cuts through the chill. It belongs to the radiant son of prophecy, glowing with celestial light and wrapped in unyielding devotion to his father's authority. He steps forward to lecture her on respect, his gaze burning with icy disdain. But his defense of the king is merely a convenient lie. Beneath his dazzling brilliance lies a dark, obsessive secret, a hidden longing for the quiet goddess of the hearth, a woman sworn to eternal purity. He does not serve the throne out of loyalty. He serves it because the throne keeps his impossible desire locked safely away. To challenge the king would mean burning the world down for a love he can never touch, so he settles for playing the dutiful heir. A sharp, unspoken understanding passes between them. With a subtle, velvet-draped thread about resting beside a warm fireplace, she lets him know his secret is not as safe as he believes. His sunlit perfection twists in silent rage, forced to retreat into the shadows of his own shame. The king reclaims the room before the quiet war can escalate, returning to the core of his absolute decree. The match will not be delayed. The choice will not be left to time or romance. It will be decided now, in this very room. A cold realization sets in. The prospective candidates are not a vast horizon of mortal suitors or distant lords. The field has been narrowed to the very gods sitting around the table. Her eyes sweep across the powerful men of the High Council, sizing them up like dynamic pieces on a game board. The king is naturally out of the question, as is the untamed lord of the seas, whose trail of shattered hearts spans across every ocean. She shifts her gaze to the wild deity of wine, who sits quietly swirling his cup, blissfully indifferent to the drama unfolding around him. His mind is a chaos of wild indulgence and unpredictable madness, hardly the anchor a goddess of passion needs. The stern goddess of wisdom snatches the glass from his hand, cutting off his escape into intoxication before a word can even be uttered. Half of the divine court is eliminated in a single breath, leaving only a handful of options, each more flawed and dangerous than the last. As her eyes drift toward the remaining shadows of the hall, a chilling thought lingering in the air. The trap is closing, and whoever she chooses might just burn Olympus to the ground. The choices dwindle down to a knife's edge, and a youth steps forward, wearing a playful grin that masks a sharp, scheming mind. He presents himself like a charming, harmless soldier, but she sees right through the theatrical modesty. Beneath that youthful facade lies the most cunning messenger on the mountain, a boy playing at men's games. She dismisses him with a cold glance, leaving him to clutch his chest in dramatic mock heartbreak. Then her eyes shift to the brute force of the room. The Lord of War sits tall, chest bared, arrogance practically oozing from every pore. His golden hair catches the hall's ambient glow, and his smirk makes it abundantly clear. He believes the prize is already his. He thinks their past dalliances guarantee his victory. But gazing at his flawless, smug face, she feels no passion, only an overwhelming urge to wipe that condescending grin right off his lips. She looks away, and her gaze falls upon the final option. Sitting in the shadows beside the Golden Warrior is the outcast, the broken artisan, rejected by his own mother at birth and scarred by the earth. While the Lord of War radiates restless ambition, this isolated blacksmith sits completely motionless. And then something unnatural happens. Every man in the room, whether divine or mortal, looks at her with an insatiable hunger. She is used to reading the burning desperation in their eyes, the raw, unrefined desire for absolute perfection. Even the sun god had to fight his own instincts around her. But the artisan looks at her and sees nothing. His eyes are like cold ash, dead volcanoes stripped of all heat. There is no awe, no lust, not even a flicker of curiosity. He looks at the ultimate symbol of beauty as if she were merely another block of cold iron waiting to be hammered. The silence stings worse than an insult. For the goddess of love, a man's indifference is the ultimate blasphemy. Her blood boils, psychological tension filling the air like ozone before a strike. She stares at him, desperate to find a crack in that stoic mask, but finds only an unyielding abyss. Before she can step forward and force a reaction, the king's voice shatters the quiet. A dark, mocking chuckle reverberates through the hall. The ruler of the skies has watched her intense, fixated glare and misread it entirely. Or perhaps he simply chose to twist it to his advantage. With a smooth, devious smile, the king announces that the choice is clear, interpreting her burning, angry stare as a look of deep, sudden affection. He declares the match made. The room holds its breath as the truth settles in. She didn't choose the Golden Warrior. She didn't choose the charming messenger. By simply trying to break a man who felt nothing for her, she inadvertently sealed her fate to the quietest monster in the hall. And as the king calls for a grand celebration, the blacksmith remains silent in the corner, leaving everyone to wonder, did the ultimate goddess just fall into a trap of her own pride, or is something far darker waiting for her at the altar? The divine outrage explodes in an instant. The Lord of War leaps from his seat, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings as he tries to violently overturn the king's sudden judgment. But before his divine power can flare, silent metallic figures materialize from the thin air, automaton warriors forged from cold bronze, mindless, soulless, and completely immune to the terror that war usually instills. They pin the aggressive god in place, binding his immense strength effortlessly. Humiliated, the god of blood spits vile insults at the craftsman, mocking his broken body, calling him worthless, shocking the goddess of love with his sheer, raw malice between brothers. Yet around the grand table, the divine council barely blinks. The queen mother merely buries her face in her hands, turning away from her fractured sons in weary indifference. This is an old, ugly family routine. Then the quiet blacksmith moves. With a single, passive gesture, a massive bronze hand clamps over the warrior god's lower face, smothering his rage into muffled, useless hums. And for the very first time, the silent craftsman speaks. His voice does not belong to the bright heights of Olympus. It carries a terrifying, hollow resonance, deep, heavy, and infinitely old. It feels like an anvil hidden 10 miles beneath the earth, forged through 10,000 years of absolute isolation and silent endurance. It is a sound so grounding, so overwhelmingly heavy, that the goddess of beauty almost loses her balance, her silk robe slipping against her ankles. In a few calm, devastating words, the outcast reminds the god of war that throwing a pathetic tantrum only shatters whatever dignity he has left. He settles the violent room without raising his hand in anger, and then, with quiet reverence, defers the floor back to the sovereign. Seizing the moment to end the chaotic spectacle, the king delivers the final decree. The goddess of desire and the god of the forge are officially betrothed, bound together by absolute decree. A cold, bitter tide washes over the hall. The crowd erupts into a subtle storm of divine judgment. The god of war continues to squirm in silent hums. Wisdom glares in open contempt. The messenger chuckles in the background, and whispering judgment ripples through the ranks. In an instant, the standard of absolute beauty has been reduced to the punchline of a political play. The goddess closes her eyes as the isolation settles deep in her chest. She turns her gaze back to her newly appointed husband, hoping to catch a crack in his stoic expression, a hint of triumph, or fear, or secret desire. But his pale eyes remain entirely dead, like cold gray ash. A horrifying realization dawns upon her. He knew this was coming all along. He laid the trap in complete silence, crafting the very tools to enforce it. She realizes too late that she walked willingly into a pit of ancient snakes. Olympus was never a sanctuary. It was a realm built on dethroned fathers, swallowed lovers, and relentless conquest. Her cosmic bloodline made her a threat, and this forced union was her cage. Without looking back at the king, without acknowledging the cold groom who just bought her freedom with silence, she turns on her heel and leaves the grand chamber, her mind already racing to survive the prison she must now call a marriage. The news spreads like a fever through the lower realms of Olympus, a toxic whisper that clings to the marble pillars and slithers through the shadowed gardens. The radiant standard of absolute beauty, the immortal lover of every mortal's tragic dream, has been officially bound in sacred matrimony, and the name linked to hers sends a shiver of grotesque disbelief through the court. Hephaestus. To the minor spirits, the nymphs, and the lesser gods who watch from the periphery, the union feels less like a royal wedding and more like a cruel cosmic joke. The divine realm rarely binds its rulers in formal, inescapable vows. Offspring are born from impulse and shadow. Alliances rise and fall in temporary beds. But a true, permanent marriage among the High Lords is a rare, heavy chain, one reserved for political dominance or silent punishment. In the corridors of power, gossip becomes a currency, whispered between servants who read the subtle shifts in their master's eyes. A monstrous narrative begins to take shape, built on half-truths, suppressed scandals, and the terrifying reputation of the throne. The lesser gods remember the chaotic squabbles, the arrogant lord of war openly chasing her favor, but the rumors twist deeper into the dark. They whisper that the sovereign king himself looked upon the newcomer with hungry, possessive eyes, setting the stage for a silent, lethal war between father and son. Whispers claim the Lord of the Seas and the bright god of prophecy were drawn into the same web of desire, turning the high court into a powder keg of divine lust. And so, as the story goes, the sovereign queen had to step in, a desperate move to neutralize a threat that could tear the mountain apart. Why choose the scarred artisan over the golden warrior? The answer whispered in the dark is simple, cold, and dark. The king would rather hand the ultimate prize to a broken, quiet outcast who poses no threat to his crown, than let his powerful sons grow bolder on the taste of supreme beauty. The lower court chuckles at the tragic ironies, convincing themselves they have decoded the minds of the High Council. But as the rumors grow wilder, one terrifying truth remains. The bride is returning to her lonely chambers, locked into a union designed to neutralize her influence, while the silent groom waits in the depths of his forge, leaving all of Olympus to wonder. Did the king truly tame the chaos, or did he just hand the ultimate spark to the one god who knows how to build a world-ending fire? The rumors across the mountain take on a life of their own, painting a tragic portrait of a broken goddess, weeping in her private chambers over a cruel twist of fate, betrayed by royal vanity and condemned to an unwanted union. The minor spirits offer their quiet sympathies, half wrapped in genuine pity, half dripping with bitter satisfaction. Yet, the truth behind closed doors is delightfully far from tragic. The sanctuary of the love goddess remains an unrivaled spectacle of divine opulence, framed by pearl columns and delicate vines that bloom with eternal roses. Wallowing in sorrow is a luxury for mortals, not for high divinity, and she certainly has no intention of wasting her time on self-pity. Instead, the so-called tragic bride is entirely consumed with a far more rewarding distraction, unwrapping an endless stream of extravagant wedding gifts sent by the high court. First comes a chest from the stern goddess of wisdom, filled with rare, shimmering textiles. Touching the smooth, leather-like fabric against her skin, the bride selects a gleaming length of thread to craft her next festival gown, casually instructing her attendants to store the rest. Next is a box of blinding gold, bound in solid metallic thread. It is a loud, unapologetic offering from the sun god himself, who is forced to send a fortune in rare instruments, swan feather cloaks, and medicinal fruits just to maintain appearances before his father. She smiles at the desperation behind his generosity, dismissing the priceless treasures to her overflowing vault with a wave of her hand. Gift after gift arrives from the High Council, filling her halls with rare tokens and glittering tributes. Receiving offerings from equals is a power dynamic she deeply enjoys, a subtle reminder that even in a forced arrangement, her presence demands absolute homage. Just as she contemplates which divine treasure to inspect next, an attendant quietly approaches her side with an unexpected message. A dark, quiet messenger has arrived at her threshold, bearing a gift from the deep, unspoken depths below. Stepping out into the grand courtyard, the bride expects a messenger from the underworld, ready to receive a dark token from the subterranean realm. Instead, she finds a humble servant bearing the quiet emblem of the blacksmith. The messenger bows low, presenting an unexpectedly plain silver chest on behalf of his silent master. It is an unadorned, heavy block of metal, offering no hint of the craftsmanship hidden within. When questioned about its contents, the servant simply reveals its name, describing it as a specialized girdle forged by the artisan's own hands, accompanied by a cryptic instruction. Its true nature will only reveal itself when worn before a mirror. Driven by an irresistible spark of curiosity, she retreats to her inner sanctuary and unlatches the simple silver container. The breath catches in her throat. Laying inside is a creation of breathtaking, peerless artistry. Golden vines of astonishing delicate detail wrap through layers of sculpted rosebuds, each accented with soft, pale pearls that catch the ambient light. Compared to this masterwork, even the lavish treasures of the sun god feel crude and unrefined. As she lifts the golden strap, it glides across her fingers with impossible smoothness. Entranced, she wraps the creation around her waist, where it clings to her silhouette as if forged for her body alone. She turns to face a reflection, and the world seems to pause. The mirror reflects a vision so devastatingly hypnotic that even she, the living embodiment of perfection, is rendered speechless. The artifact amplifies her innate charm to an absolute, terrifying extreme, radiating a magnetic aura that demands complete surrender. Behind her, her attendants sink to their knees, overwhelmed by the sheer, unyielding weight of her irresistible presence. A slow, triumphant smile spreads across her lips. In a single moment, all the worthless tributes of the High Council fade into insignificance. The quiet, broken craftsman who seemed completely immune to her presence had delivered the ultimate tribute to her divine nature. Perhaps the silent blacksmith is not as unfeeling as he pretended to be. Amused and thoroughly enchanted by the gift, she decides to grant him an immediate favor. Turning to her servants, she orders them to guide her directly to the fiery depths of his subterranean workshop. The sanctuary of the divine blacksmith resembles a fortress far more than a celestial residence, enclosed by towering stone barriers and massive iron gates that seal off the interior from the rest of Olympus. Where other divine estates feature open marble colonnades and lush gardens, this domain stands isolated, stark, and uncompromisingly quiet. At the goddess's arrival, the heavy iron doors grind open with a deep, echoing groan, revealing a dignified steward who steps forward to greet her. Though clearly struck by the hypnotic allure of the golden girdle around her waist, the servant maintains his composure, bowing deeply while inquiring about the purpose of her unannounced visit. Upon learning that she seeks an immediate audience with his master, the steward offers a polite but firm refusal. He explains that the artisan is currently locked deep within his primary workshop, utilizing the extreme volcanic heat harvested from the island of Lemnos. The flames in that specific forge burn with an intense, volatile brilliance capable of melting the hardest metals, the very fires used to fashion the lightning weapons of the sovereign ruler. When the blacksmith works under those conditions, the doors remain sealed to everyone without exception. The steward attempts to soften the refusal by mentioning that even the king of Olympus was once turned away while the forge was active. However, invoking the king's name in this context proves to be an unfortunate error. Rather than pacifying the goddess, the comparison strikes her as an insinuation that her presence holds no more weight than anyone else's. Dismissing the steward's hasty apologies, she steps past him with effortless authority. When he attempts to intervene, a subtle wave of her divine presence pushes him back, leaving him unable to block her path. The minor workshop spirits hovering in the shadows, instantly mesmerized by the magic of the golden belt, offer no resistance. Complying with her haughty demand, the small creatures immediately guide her through the dimly lit passages, leading her straight toward the sweltering subterranean depths where the master craftsman works alone. Guided through the sterile, secure corridors, the goddess finally reaches the inner sanctum, a massive iron barrier sealing off the primary forge, and as the heavy door swings open, a devastating wave of pure, volcanic heat crashes over her. The temperature within is absolute, the raw breath of the Lemnos volcano captured in a single space, and it is an environment that would turn a mortal to ash in a heartbeat. Though protected by her divinity, the sheer intensity makes her falter, but as her senses reel, an automatic reflex takes over, a strange, forgotten language slipping from her lips. The cryptic, reflexive spell instantly blankets her in a protective aura, filtering the scorching air and soothing her sensitized skin. It leaves her stunned, not by the magical relief, but by the mysterious origin of the incantation itself, as it feels less like an innate power and more like a deeply embedded lesson from a teacher who never existed. She feels a fleeting, phantom warmth, an echo of someone showing her the intricate threads of power without judgment, but before she can grasp the slipping memory, the reality of the workshop shatters her focus. The air itself screams with a rhythmic, thunderous clang that drowns out the world. Moving further into the oppressive heat, past mountains of rare, unrefined ores, she spots the colossal furnace, its blazing lava twisting the very dimension around it. Near the heart of this sweltering, dizzying chaos, isolated from the noise and the fire, she finally finds him. Her attempt to call out is a useless gesture, her voice immediately swallowed by the violence of the hammering. He is completely lost in his work, seemingly indifferent to the presence of another deity, but as she watches him, her irritation gives way to a shocking, unscripted observation. Stripped down to a basic tunic, the craftsman's true form is fully exposed for the first time, and it is not what she expected. This is a body forged and sculpted not by warfare, but by the relentless discipline of fire and metal, with powerful arms, broad shoulders, and unyielding thigh muscles that flex and ripple with every massive strike. The contemptuous nicknames, the rumors of ugliness and ruin, all seem to wither in the light of this raw, hidden vitality. Even his face, while perhaps lacking the polished symmetry favored on Olympus, is far from grotesque, reminding her that notoriously exaggerated tales often hide the most unsettling human truths. When judged against the absolute standard of cosmic beauty, every face on Mount Olympus seems flawed, yet inspecting the craftsman up close reveals a strangely compelling composition. His jaw is heavy and sharply defined, his brow set in a rugged line, and his full lips possess a raw, grounding warmth entirely absent in the polished statues of the sun god. Looking at those features, an unexpected spark of intrigue settles in her chest, a sudden sensory yearning to feel that rough, intense presence pressed against her skin. Lost in these rising desires, she takes a reckless step forward, only to trigger a sudden mechanical trap built into the floor itself. Before she can react, the stone beneath her feet shoots violently upward, hoisting her high above the sweltering workshop on a rising pillar. The abrupt commotion shatters the craftsman's absolute focus. Dropping his heavy tools, he turns toward the intrusion, his deep voice slicing through the air like a blade, demanding to know who dare disturb his inner sanctuary. As the mechanism slowly lowers her back to the fiery ground, she attempts to play off the intrusion, flashing an effortlessly enchanting smile as if they were meeting by appointment. Yet, when his dark, fiery eyes lock onto hers, his stoic mask shatters completely. He looks at her not merely with surprise, but with a profound, haunted recognition, his voice dropping into a cryptic whisper as if confronting a ghost from a forgotten life. His sudden, intense focus sends an electric wave of psychological tension directly into her stomach, making her heart violently beat and leaving her dizzy from an emotion she cannot even name. Struggling to maintain her haughty composure, she demands to be set back down on solid ground. With a single, silent gesture, he resets the mechanism, lowering her to his level before coldly questioning how she managed to bypass every security measure in his fortress. She replies with customary arrogance, boasting that his guard tried to turn her away using the king's name, but she simply ignored the warning. To her complete surprise, instead of chastising her for the forced entry, the master craftsman takes her side without hesitation, declaring that he will severely punish his servant for daring to place the sovereign's authority above her presence. And as she stands before him in the sweltering heat, wrapped in the magic of his golden gift, she realizes that the quiet outcast of Olympus might be playing a far deeper, far more dangerous game than anyone on the High Council ever anticipated. The sweltering heat of the forge presses against her, but the emotional frost between them feels far colder. He does not welcome her with open arms, nor does he offer the eager, worshipful praise she is accustomed to receiving from every soul on Mount Olympus. Instead, he simply urges her toward the exit, his posture rigid and his expression unreadable, radiating a subtle discomfort that cuts deeper than open hostility. Stepping carefully off the lowered mechanism, she masks her rising unease with a sharp, defensive sarcasm, mocking his intricate machines and questioning if his own traps would dare claim their creator. Yet her stinging words fall into a void of total silence. The quiet stretched between them grows suffocating, and to her frustration, she finds herself rambling just to fill the quiet, a nervous habit she detests admitting even to herself. When she finally steals a glance at him, the sight catches in her throat. Draped in nothing more than a lightweight tunic suited for the intense heat of the forge, his raw, muscular physique is fully exposed. A sudden, unbidden warmth flushes across her skin, a humiliating reaction that leaves her flustered and furious. Why should the goddess of desire feel intimidated by a man who barely acknowledges her presence? Unable to decipher his thoughts, she snaps at him to cover himself, spitting out a cruel insult about his appearance just to regain her footing. It is a harsh, petulant lash, born purely from her own rising confusion. Yet his reaction is shockingly gentle. Without a trace of anger or wounded pride, he quietly pulls his heavy cloak around his body, concealing his form and his scarred leg, before offering her a fresh piece of fruit. He accepts her harsh words with a calm, stoic grace, even agreeing with her cold assessment, effortlessly deflecting the venom in her tone. The unexpected kindness, leaves her caught between shame and profound relief. In a realm where everyone views her through the lens of absolute temptation, this quiet blacksmith looks directly into her eyes without expectation or judgment. She finds herself wondering if this subtle, disarming effect is some hidden power he possesses, a quiet magic designed to break down her defenses without ever raising his voice. And as she stands beside him in the glowing twilight of the subterranean forge, she realizes that the greatest threat to her composure is not the grand politics of the king's court, but the mysterious, unyielding nature of the man she is destined to marry. A dismissive shrug of his massive shoulders is all the explanation he offers, his quiet voice echoing off the cavernous stone walls. He reminds her, with absolute detachment, that his domain begins and ends with fire, metal, and creation, leaving the tangled webs of mortal and divine emotions entirely to others. It is a logical claim, yet when she playfully muses whether some cosmic destiny is weaving their paths together, the atmospheric shift in the chamber is immediate and chilling. The calm composure on his face vanishes, replaced by a dark, severe gravity. He shuts down the notion of fate with a cold, almost visceral denial that leaves her momentarily stunned. Before she can probe the depth of that sudden darkness, he brusquely redirects the conversation, demanding to know the true purpose behind her uninvited arrival. Swallowing her rising irritation, she gestures toward the shimmering, enchanted sash wrapped around her waist, the priceless gift he had crafted and delivered to her doorstep. The ancient artifact holds the divine power to bend the desires of gods and mortals alike, yet as he glances at it, he remains completely immune to its dangerous charm. His only response is a flat, offhand compliment, treating the legendary creation as nothing more than a simple trinket. When she insists on offering something of equal value in return, he quietly shuts her down, pointing out that a groom requires no compensation for honoring his bride. The subtle, knowing smirk that touches his lips catches her entirely off guard, proving he understands her defensive pride far better than she would care to admit. Her frustration gives way to a creeping, irresistible curiosity. Amid the grand illusions and relentless politeness of Mount Olympus, this brooding blacksmith stands out as an enigma, an anchor of absolute, unfiltered truth. He claims to hide no dark secrets, merely choosing to keep his private depth reserved for himself. Driven by an impulsive urge to shatter his unyielding composure and strip away his guarded veil, she presents a sudden, perilous challenge. She proposes a binding pact, sworn upon the dark, unbreakable waters of the underworld, where both must expose their most guarded truths or suffer a catastrophic price. It is a reckless gamble that no sane deity would ever consider, yet as she locks her gaze onto him in the flickering subterranean light, waiting for his refusal, she realizes she has pushed the stoic craftsman directly to the edge of a dangerous abyss. To draw him into her game, she lays down the rules with a playful, mischievous glint in her eyes, 3 simple questions bound by an absolute, primordial oath. When he points out that a simple conversation would suffice without summoning the terrifying weight of the underworld, she smirks, falsely boasting about her talent for deception. It is an obvious bluff, a shield of arrogance meant to hide her restless intrigue, but the craftsman sees right through it. With a weary sigh, he warns her of the consequences. Swearing upon the dark waters of the Styx leaves no room for falsehood, securing her in the very trap she is attempting to set for him. Yet, her pride refuses to let her back down, and with a heavy, resigned breath, he finally accepts the dangerous wager. He leads her deeper into his private living quarters, a barren, shadowy sanctuary that stands in stark, unsettling contrast to the glittering palaces of Mount Olympus. The high, dark stone walls are completely unadorned, stripped of luxury or excess, creating an eerie, solitary atmosphere that feels more like a forgotten tomb than a divine residence. Stepping into the austere space, she cannot help but remark on the dreariness of his surroundings, playfully mocking his total lack of aesthetic flair. Yet, when he quietly insists that he possesses no talent for creating beauty, focusing solely on cold, practical function, she scoffs in disbelief. She touches the exquisite, enchanted belt at her waist, reminding him that the creator of such a masterpiece could never be blind to art. His reaction, however, completely disarms her. With a faint, mournful smile, he explains that the belt's delicate, breathtaking design was merely an afterthought, a desperate, clumsy attempt to craft something that might be worthy of her. There is no deceit in his eyes, only a quiet, heartbreaking sincerity that accepts his own perceived flaws without a shred of ego. Stunned by his raw vulnerability, her desire to unravel his mystery only deepens. Together, they speak the solemn, binding words, invoking the ancient, terrifying power of the subterranean river to seal their pact. Eager to shatter his unyielding composure and catch a glimpse of the hidden man beneath the blacksmith, she playfully hands him the first question, waiting to see his stoic armor crack. Yet, as the heavy silence of the underworld settles over the gloomy hall, she realizes too late that in her haste to expose his secrets, she has willingly bound herself to a dark, unpredictable game where her own heart might be the ultimate prize. The solemn vow, sworn upon the dark and absolute waters of the Styx, settles over the shadowy hall like a heavy, suffocating weight. With the game officially underway, the craftsman claims the first move, cutting straight through divine politics with a single, sharp inquiry, demanding to know why she ever agreed to the union. Trying to brush off the gravity of the question, she offers a superficial response, claiming she merely acquiesced to the king's supreme command. Yet, under the absolute truth enforced by the underworld oath, her evasion crumbles. The craftsman gently pushes past her defense, reminding her that a true command leaves room for choices among suitable suitors, forcing her to confront the reality of how she was trapped. As the pieces connect in her mind, a sickening realization takes hold. The king of the gods had never offered her a genuine selection of suitors, nor was this union a carefully weighed decision to maintain peace. It was an elaborate facade, a calculated manipulation designed to strip away her agency while deceiving her into believing she had made a choice. The realization that she was duped, treated as a pawn in an imperial game, ignites a fiery rage within her chest, tempting her to unleash a wave of divine fury that could burn the golden halls to the ground. Yet, as her wrath peaks, she catches sight of the craftsman's face, expecting cold triumph or quiet amusement. Instead, she sees a subtle, profound shadow of pain in his dark eyes. The revelation of the king's deception hurts him just as deeply, proving that he too is an unwilling captive in this orchestrated destiny. Before she can process her lingering anger or offer a word of unexpected comfort, the silence is broken as he pivots directly into his second question. Looking at her with total seriousness, he asks if, now knowing the full depth of the king's betrayal, she wishes to dissolve the betrothal entirely, offering to tear up the union himself without a single demand. His calm, effortless offer leaves her utterly stunned, her mind spinning as the heavy weight of his proposal hangs in the cool, silent air of the subterranean vault. And as she stares into the eyes of the one man who seems entirely willing to let her go, she finds herself trapped in a mesmerizing psychological duel where every answer carries the power to rewrite their shared future. The weight of the ancient oath hangs thick in the dark chamber, enforcing an absolute truth that leaves no room for hesitation or superficial pride. Her mind races against the trap she built for herself, forced to confront the harsh reality of the king's grand betrayal while staring into the steady, unyielding eyes of the craftsman. Every god on Olympus sought to own her, to pin her radiant divinity to their chest like a prize. Yet here stands the one outcast, holding the power to claim her through imperial decree, offering instead to completely erase the betrothal and grant her absolute freedom with a single word. His maddening composure only heightens the psychological tension between them, a stark reminder of just how deeply he stands apart from the ruthless politics of the high court. Driven by a sudden, turbulent surge of emotions she can barely comprehend, she closes the distance between them, her fingers tightening around the rough fabric of his tunic. With raw, unvarnished honesty, she yields to the truth of the underworld river, declaring that she will not break the bond. The admission leaves her breathless, confused by her own fierce refusal to walk away from a trap set by the king. Sensory dizziness washes over her, an overwhelming tide of confusion and pride that threatens to pull her under. But before she can fall, his powerful hands catch her, anchoring her fragile composure with effortless strength and surprising gentle care. In that fleeting, intimate proximity, the goddess who governs all desire feels the sudden, terrifying sting of her own heart racing, an electric vulnerability she has spent an eternity inflicting on others. Stepping back into the cool, shadowy air, he prepares to invoke his final question under the sacred pact. A quiet, profound stillness falls over the subterranean fortress as he looks directly into her eyes, stripping away every illusion of courtly duty and imperial control. In a voice steady and devoid of deceit, he asks if she will truly choose him of her own free will, transforming a forced political decree into a genuine, unyielding proposal. A quiet warmth blooms beneath her skin, dissolving the lingering bitterness of the king's grand illusion. For the first time, she is offered complete agency, respected enough to give a choice that carries no strings, no games, and no deceit. Looking into his honest, fiery gaze, she speaks her vow, bound not by fear of the Styx or the demands of the throne, but by the undeniable, mysterious current drawing her toward the forge. And as a rare, shadowy relief lightens the rugged features of her future husband, she realizes that the remaining questions in their game no longer matter, for in the heart of the subterranean dark, the most unpredictable bond on Mount Olympus has just been forged. The golden light of dawn cascades across the sacred sanctuary as the morning star climbs the sky, announcing the arrival of the long-awaited divine union. A hush falls over the inner chambers, where celestial maidens weave delicate starlight and the intoxicating perfume of 1,000 blossoms around the bride, transforming the air into a heavy, intoxicating tapestry of scent and shadow. Attired in a breathtaking bridal gown crafted with pristine, flawless elegance by the goddess of wisdom, the bride gazes into the polished bronze mirror. Her shimmering reflection captures a striking contrast, an ethereal, unrivaled beauty framed by the sharp, protective intellect of her closest companion. Yet beneath the radiant facade, a deep psychological tension simmers. Behind her eyes lingers a shadowy unrest, a persistent, eerie cycle of recurring nightmares that has haunted her sleep since her secret encounter in the subterranean forge. In these fleeting, shadowy dreams, she sees herself not as a ruler of passion, but as a lost, violent phantom drifting across a storm-tossed sea, desperately searching every barren shore for something or someone that was promised, weeping tears of unexplained anguish into the crashing waves. The enigmatic visions slip away like mist upon waking, leaving only a lingering ache, a haunting shadow of a forgotten promise. Even the masters of dreams could offer no answers to the riddle of her lost memories, forcing her to lock the secret away in silence. But as the goddess of wisdom notices the sudden pale flicker across her face, she quietly offers her quiet support, a subtle shield against the watchful, ravenous eyes of Mount Olympus. The heavy velvet curtains sweep aside, shattered by the authoritative tone of the Queen of Heaven, arriving to escort the bride not with a mother's warmth, but with cold, political formality. For the royal matriarch, this union is merely a public duty, a calculated display that utterly ignores the groom she once discarded. Stepping toward the grand hall as the wedding trumpets echo across the marble peak, the bride smiles through the veil of lingering doubt, convincing herself that a peaceful coexistence is all she requires from this strange, quiet blacksmith. Yet, as she walks toward the altar, an eerie sense of foreshadowing whispers that the forgotten truths sealed within her dreams are about to break their silence. Mount Olympus rests in an eternal, perfect spring, powered by the devotion of mortals who plant olive groves and construct gleaming marble temples to honor the divine. On this day, every celestial resident gathers on the floating realm to celebrate a union, cheering as a carriage pulled by pristine white swans glides down a path illuminated by starlight. Escorted by the Queen of Heaven, the bride walks the dazzling procession. Yet beneath the breathtaking spectacle, exhaustion quickly sets in. To pass the time as she approaches the distant altar, her eyes scan the elevated gallery of Olympians, past the goddess of wisdom chatting with the moon huntress, past the god of wine lounging on his couch, and notices a prominent absence. The Queen of Heaven, sensing her glance, coldly notes that her second son, the war god, was explicitly forbidden from attending. Misinterpreting the bride's quiet indifference, the queen turns her voice into a knife, warning her never to direct her dangerous charm toward her favored child. With sharp composure, the bride retorts that her groom is also the queen's son, a remark that instantly ignites the matriarch's deep-seated hatred for her discarded firstborn. The queen threatens dire consequences if the names of her two sons are ever linked again, but the bride merely smiles with exaggerated politeness, stashing the queen's fiery protectiveness away in her mind as a future weapon. Touching the war god would mean destroying the queen's fragile peace, a tempting option for a rainy day. Reaching the end of the starry path, the king of the gods greets her with lavish, empty compliments, praising her unrivaled beauty with standard imperial flattery. She meets his praise with a dull, unbothered stare, fully aware of the deception that brought her to this altar. Prompted by the supreme ruler, the groom steps out from the shadows of the dais. Dressed for the ceremony, the master craftsman appears just as she remembered, stoic, grounded, and unyielding. And as she extends her hand to meet his, she realizes that the true challenge of this union is not the public farce of Olympus, but the dangerous, magnetic connection slowly forging between her and the quiet blacksmith at her side. The bride steps forward along the path woven from starlight and delicate gold, her presence radiating a calm, intoxicating grace that demands total devotion. Dressed in an exquisite crown and heavy, regal robes, the groom meets her gaze, offering no lavish praise or worshipful flatteries, but merely a quiet, grounded acknowledgement of her presence. She matches his tone with sharp composure, masking her intrigue beneath a veil of cool indifference as the king of the gods gestures for the sacred vows to begin. She releases her grip on the queen's hand, reaching out to clasp the hand of her future husband. But just before their fingers touch, an impossible, unnatural winter crashes through the realm. The perpetual spring of the celestial peak vanishes in an instant, replaced by a suffocating, bone-chilling frost that locks the cloudless sky in a pale, icy grip. Breath turns to white mist, sending a wave of deep psychological tension and primal fear through the assembled deities. High above the northern horizon, a dark, unnatural stain spreads across the frozen sky, approaching the altar like an ink spill on pristine silk. Standing beside her, the quiet blacksmith lets out a low, weary sigh, murmuring that the inevitable has finally arrived. Before she can question his cryptic words, he gently takes her hand, announcing to the frozen sanctuary the identity of the impending doom. Descending on massive, shadow-drenched wings, 3 terrifying figures tear through the winter sky, alighting directly upon the bride's path. Born from ancient, primordial vengeance, their pale forms are wrapped in dark scales, their heads writhing with venomous serpents while tears of blood trail down their spectral faces. They radiate a horrific, absolute authority, driving lesser spirits to collapse in terror as even the highest rulers draw back in stunned silence. The king of the gods steps forward, his usual arrogance faltering beneath a heavy mask of tension as he attempts to greet the ancient arbiters. Yet the terrifying sisters look upon the supreme ruler not with respect, but with a cold, piercing disgust, as if staring at something utterly vile. Their dark, blade-like voices echo through the frozen air, calling out the king's name and plunging the wedding into an eerie, unpredictable abyss. While the terrifying cold of the winter sky freezes the lower spirits in sheer panic, the bride stands unyielding, anchored by the towering, stone-like presence of the master craftsman beside her. Standing before the primordial sisters of retribution, he raises his voice without a single note of fear, calmly demanding the purpose of their sudden intrusion. The 3 shadowy figures turn their gaze entirely away from the king of the gods, looking upon him with absolute disgust, but when their pale, blood-stained faces turn to the bride, their blade-like voices echo in a strange, haunting chorus, welcoming her not as a stranger, but as their youngest sister born from the ancient blood of the sky. Their eerie, rhythmic chant sends a wave of psychological tension through the frozen sanctuary. They reveal that they have descended onto the sacred peak as solemn witnesses to a forgotten vow, an ancient pact sealed long before she ever rose from the sea, where her very memories were laid down as collateral. As she struggles to comprehend their cryptic words, a sudden sharp pain flares through her hand. The blacksmith squeezes her fingers with desperate, breathtaking force, a subtle reaction that betrays a hidden, violent tremor beneath his stoic mask. The ancient sisters warn that if the oath is broken on this fateful day, her lost past will belong to them forever, leaving her trapped in a game where she does not even know the rules. Seeing the shadowy arbiters step forward to claim their due, she shrinks back, only to be pulled securely behind the craftsman's broad shoulders. A distinct, intoxicating scent sweeps over her senses, a rich, sensual mixture of raw fire, dark ash, and unyielding patience. Holding her safely behind his back, he steps forward to confront the terrifying entities, his voice steady, sharp, and entirely devoid of fear. And as the air thickens with ancient magic, the court of Mount Olympus watches in stunned silence, realizing that this wedding is no longer a political play, but the stage for a dangerous, long-forgotten war over a goddess's lost soul. Behind the craftsman's impassive facade, a hidden tremor of raw, protective instinct ripples through his broad back. Sensing the unspoken shift, the bride watches as he steps into the line of fire, shielding her body with his own and demanding that the vengeful entities deal directly with him. The terrifying sisters sneer, their dark, withered lips curling into a cruel mockery of a smile. They dismiss him with biting disdain, mocking his lineage and warning a mere son of the royal house not to interfere in the sacred affairs of primordial blood. Yet he does not flinch. Instead, he claims a quiet, terrifying authority, declaring with total composure that he holds every right to stand between them and their target. Enraged by his defiance, the three arbiters unleash an ancient, suffocating sorcery. The ambient light warps, locking the three of them inside an isolated bubble of reality where the outside world melts into silence. Beyond the magical veil, the king of the gods can be seen thrashing and shouting, his thunderous voice reduced to nothing more than a muffled murmur beneath deep water. As a wave of isolation and helplessness threatens to pull the bride into panic, the quiet blacksmith utters a single, cryptic name, Limnos. He speaks not of war or divine laws, but begins listing the rustic details of his remote, volcanic sanctuary, describing the almond groves, the olive harvests, and the humble offerings left by mortals at the foot of his blazing forge. The dark sisters snap at him to cease his nonsensical babble, raising their massive, shadow-drenched wings to unleash a gale of bitter, agonizing frost. But just as the freezing wind threatens to sweep them away, the blacksmith's voice roars through the tempest, commanding absolute silence. He looks directly into the ancient eyes of the vengeance spirits, tightening his grip on the bride's hand until the pressure is almost unbearable. With a low, deliberate weight in his voice, he speaks of a single, forgotten detail from that distant island, a solitary pearl that once washed ashore on the western sandbar long ago. In an instant, the violent storm dies. The writhing serpents upon their heads drop silent, and the dark wings fold back into the shadows, as the terrifying sisters recognize a secret truth that alters the entire game. The single, cryptic mention of the remote volcanic island echoes through the icy silence, striking the ancient arbiters like a physical blow. Their dark, withered faces twist in sudden realization as a horrific, ear-splitting laughter erupts from their lips, razor-sharp and echoing through the isolated magical sphere. The terrifying sisters mock the unspoken truth, revealing that the bride's ancient, forgotten oath was tied to the craftsman all along. Turning their venomous gaze back to the bride, they declare that the sacred pact is actively being fulfilled. By standing beside the quiet blacksmith, she has unknowingly stepped onto the path of her destiny, keeping her lost memories safe from their ravenous grip. With a bitter, lingering curse warning that breaking this sacred bond will forever seal her past in darkness. The primordial spirits sweep their massive, dark wings, tearing back into the frozen sky and shattering the magical boundary. As reality snaps back and the surrounding Olympians rush forward in a chaotic frenzy, the bride stands frozen, staring at the broad back of the man who just risked everything to protect her. She feels a strange, unbidden warmth bloom in her chest, mingled with a deep psychological tension. Why would a stoic, detached blacksmith shield a bride he barely knows from the wrath of ancient gods? Before she can demand an answer, she notices blood dripping from a fresh scratch across his face, a wound earned while acting as her living shield. When she tries to inspect the mark, he gently holds her back, masking his pain with quiet dignity, refusing to let her fret over a fading scar. Yet beneath his stoic demeanor, a soft, rare hesitation lingers as he turns to her with quiet reverence, asking if she is ready to proceed with the vows. Looking into the eyes of this unpredictable, enigmatic husband, she lets out a faint, breathless laugh, realizing that her life in his shadowy forge will be anything but boring. The sacred pledges conclude with a quiet, solemn brevity, but the true spectacle begins as nectar flows like liquid gold through the halls of Mount Olympus. The divine court throws itself into wild, desperate revelry, drinking deeper and laughing louder to drown out the lingering horror of the cold, primordial visitors. Anything that threatens the illusion of their paradise must be buried under music and wine. Yet as the feast stretches late into the night, drunken voices begin searching for the guests of honor, only to realize the bride and groom vanished hours ago. Discontent and jealous whispers ripple through the crowd, unable to stomach the thought of what is unfolding behind closed doors. Far from the noisy banquet, the newlyweds arrive at their nuptial chamber, set within the lush, untouched beauty of the bride's own sanctuary. Surrounding the room with blooming petals and soft starlight, it stands in stark contrast to the rough, soot-stained world of the master blacksmith. Watching him cross the threshold as the first man ever permitted inside her private haven, she lets slip a sharp, impulsive comment, noting how completely out of place he looks. Instead of rising to the provocation, he simply agrees with quiet composure, dismissing her attempt to apologize with an easy, unbothered grace. Exhaustion from days of political clashes with the queen, combined with the harrowing confrontation at the altar, finally catches up to her. She sinks into her favorite chair with a heavy sigh, bracing herself for an awkward, tense night. Yet her stoic husband offers no demands, no heavy expectations. He merely observes her weary frame, gently suggesting that she lie down and rest. The soft, unexpected consideration catches her entirely off guard, striking through the thick wall of her defenses and leaving her staring at him in utter disbelief. Her vanity, normally so flawless, takes a sharp, stinging blow. How could a man stand before the embodiment of desire and display such total, infuriating indifference? Instead of leaping at the chance to claim his bride, he treats the moment like a quiet chore, triggering a sudden, playful realization in her mind. She leans in, probing his stoic guard with a mischievous question about his past. Beneath his stone-faced exterior, a subtle, dark crimson flush creeps up his skin, betraying the master craftsman's complete lack of experience. The rare glimpse of vulnerability in such a massive, imposing figure becomes an irresistible lure. She glides closer, winding her delicate hands around his thick, muscular forearm, fascinated by the sheer physical contrast between them. She teases his hesitation, mocking his sudden lack of confidence, but he resists her playful trap, gruffly pointing out her own missing memories and unspoken anxieties. Refusing to let heavy thoughts spoil the night, she dissolves the tension with a bright, silvery laugh, reminding him that love and passion are her natural domain, experience or not. She presses closer, throwing her weight into his broad chest until he stiffens under the sudden, intimate heat. His voice strains with intense restraint, begging her to slow down, but the subtle tremor in his frame only fuels her desire to conquer the shy blacksmith. Beneath her fingertips, The rigid cord of his muscles and the rich scent of volcanic ash and dark fire ignite an unexpected, raw sensation deep within her. Framing the moment as a matter of pride, she warns him that a cold wedding night would make her a laughingstock across the celestial court. Cornered by her sharp logic and overwhelmed by her touch, the craftsman's guarded composure finally cracks, his smoldering eyes widening as she weaves her trap, drawing the quiet god into an irresistible, intoxicating abyss. The trap snaps shut, leaving no room for retreat. Using one of her 3 sacred vows of absolute truth, she corners her stoic groom with a single, intoxicating demand, forcing him to admit the deep, undeniable hunger he harbors for his new bride. With his quiet defeat laid bare, his massive, stone-hewn arms finally give in, gathering her up like silk and carrying her toward the fragrant bed of starlight and blooms. Reclining beneath his imposing shadow, she looks up at the master craftsman, appreciating the rugged, powerful contrast he brings to her delicate haven. Though he murmurs a rare, hesitant warning about his lack of grace, his actions betray a startling, innate heat. As he parts her thin bridal garments, his calloused palms bring a surging, volcanic warmth to her bare skin, tracing over every sensitive curve until her breath catches in her throat. The illusion of a clumsy blacksmith vanishes into thin air. Every deliberate pressure and hot, lingering touch sends waves of intense, psychological heat straight to her core, twisting her hips against the bedsheets in helpless anticipation. His usually low voice drops to a dark, gravelly murmur, reverberating against her skin and sending sharp shivers down her spine. Pressing his rock-hard thigh between her legs, the immense physical strength she once admired from afar in his blazing forge now envelopes her completely. The lingering heat of his body rubs against the sheer, damp fabric of her intimates, teasing the edges of her desire, until the line between control and surrender completely dissolves, leaving them both teetering on the edge of an agonizing, irresistible passion. Bound by his overwhelming physical strength, the goddess finds herself utterly helpless. Her wrists pinned firmly above her head, every attempt to control the pace of the night crumbles under the smith's unyielding grip. Yet this complete surrender awakens a sharp, psychological thrill, a heady wave of anticipation that quickens her breath and leaves her trembling on the silk sheets. His rough, calloused hands, forged from centuries of shaping iron and fire, move over her soft skin with a startling, reverent gentleness. The contrast between his harsh texture and her delicate frame creates an almost overwhelming sensory overload, as if every touch leaves a trail of liquid heat across her skin. Raising her knees and exposing her completely to his smoldering gaze, the last remnants of her divine composure vanish. Before she can utter a word of protest, the master craftsman bows his head, plunging into her depths with an unbridled, visceral hunger that shatters his stoic persona. His warm, relentless mouth claims her core, tasting her sweetness and swallowing every breathless gasp, she surrenders to the night. Drunk on her scent and intoxicated by her taste, the blacksmith loses all restraint, drinking from her as if she were a divine nectar designed solely to unhinge his mind. With every stroke of his tongue against her sensitive pearl, a blinding electric current shoots through her frame, arching her waist and leaving her lost in a euphoric, mind-bending void, completely unaware of the dark, possessive intensity taking hold of her new husband. Tears of sheer overwhelmed pleasure trace down her flushed cheeks, mixing with the heat of their shared sweat and breathless exhaustion. To the master blacksmith, her utter vulnerability is the most breathtaking sight in existence. Driven by a primal, insatiable hunger, he continues his unyielding assault until her body reaches a shattering climax, her entire frame trembling as every nerve ending overload in a wave of ecstasy. Yet when she reaches out, yearning for the ultimate union, she finds him suddenly hesitating. His massive, rigid strength stands ready, but his mind is gripped by a sudden, protective fear. Worried that his iron-like power will bring her pain rather than pleasure, the stoic god freezes, his face a silent battlefield between dark desire and gentle restraint. Frustrated by his hesitation, the goddess of love kicks at his rock-solid frame, pleading with him to shed his doubts and complete their union. Beneath her insatiable appetite lies a profound, unspoken yearning, not just for physical release, but for the man who stood as her shield against the primordial shadows. To prove his point, he gently tests her depths with his long, calloused fingers, tracing sensitive internal curves that draw breathless, needy gasps from her lips. Realizing that her body welcomes his touch without a trace of pain, she discards her last remnants of patience. Spreading herself completely before his smoldering gaze, she unleashes a sharp, tantalizing command, urging him to abandon his hesitant restraint, yield to his darkest instincts, and claim her without mercy. The bold demand cuts through his restraint like a spark in a dry forest. Stripping away his hesitation, the master blacksmith merges their worlds in a single, devastating surge. A searing, molten shockwave travels through her core, staggering the goddess with a force she never anticipated from his imposing frame. She lets out a choked gasp, her hands beating weakly against his broad chest in a desperate reflex to anchor herself. As she looks down in equal parts panic and intoxicating thrill, she realizes with a shudder that he has barely begun. Her mind reels at the terrifying scale of his passion, yet like a moth drawn to an open flame, her pride refuses to surrender. She whispers for him to break her limits, terrified that he might pull back into the shadows. Answering her call, he presses deeper, plunging them both into an unmeasured realm where agonizing intensity and transcendent ecstasy become indistinguishable. She clings to him like a drowning soul, her arms locked behind his back as his relentless, rhythmic hammer blows echo through the sacred sanctuary, forging a bond far hotter than any metal in his subterranean fires. All coherent thought dissolves into a desperate, frantic chant of his name, echoing through the quiet halls as the craftsman yields entirely to his primal nature. Unhinged by her cries, he releases a torrential surge of divine essence deep within her, flooding her senses in repeated, throbbing waves that mark his long-suppressed awakening. Even as his formidable strength remains unyielding, a heavy, irresistible exhaustion drags her slipping consciousness into the dark. She mutters a faint, breathless complaint against the lingering sleep that robs her of more, failing to catch his pained, distorted whisper or the heavy sigh that hangs in the air. In that quiet, tragic moment of silent miscommunication, a subtle rift forms between them, leaving their newly forged destiny hanging by a fragile, uncertain thread. Morning light cascades across the sacred chamber, carrying the gentle song of wild birds and the lingering heat of an unforgettable night. Waking from a deep, restorative slumber, the goddess of love stretches lazily across the silk sheets, her body still humming with the sweet, exhausting ache of their fiery union. A playful thought flickers through her mind as she imagines surprising her stoic husband under the golden rays, wondering what intimate pet name she might whisper to soften his hard, iron exterior. Calling out softly into the quiet room, she waits for his low, gravelly rumble, but hears only silence. Thinking he might still be lost in heavy sleep, she turns with a playful smile to shake him awake, only for her hand to freeze midair. The bed beside her is pristine, cold, and utterly barren. No rumpled sheets, no discarded robes, not a single trace left behind to prove the legendary blacksmith ever shared her bed. Denial flares first. She tells herself he must be wandering her lush gardens, preparing a morning surprise, or simply seeking cool air. But as each soft excuse crumbles under the weight of reality, confusion turns into a freezing, toxic realization. He wasn't taken. He wasn't summoned. He simply walked away, abandoning the goddess of love on the very morning after their wedding night. A sharp, hysterical laugh breaks from her lips as a cold, blinding rage takes root in her chest. Reaching out in a sudden impulse, she seizes a priceless ceramic vase and shatters it against a stone floor, the explosive crash bringing her terrified nymphs rushing into the sanctuary. Facing their trembling concern, she turns on them like a vengeful storm, her eyes blazing with a terrifying, unhinged fury that shatters her gentle facade. This volatile, petty cruelty is the true, hidden nature of the divine. Though mortals build grand temples and sing praises to Mount Olympus, they pray just as fiercely to be spared from the gods' childish whims. Boundless power, without emotional maturity, creates terrifying monsters, capable of burning whole kingdoms over a bruised ego. And right now, as the abandoned bride stands among the jagged ceramic shards, her wounded pride threatens to ignite a fire that will scorch the entire court. The trembling nymphs scatter like frightened sparrows, terrified of being caught in their mistress's unbridled storm. In her blind, thrashing rage, she seizes a wall bouquet, a delicate floral arrangement she once cherished, and savagely stomps every petal into ruin. Her servants watch in mute horror, realizing that when a deity starts destroying the very things she loves, all reason has abandoned her. A sudden, jarring contrast brings her back to reality. Looking down, she notices the spilled water from the broken vase soaking through the crushed rose petals, creating a dark, crimson stain that wraps around her bare feet like fresh blood. The grotesque image sends an icy chill straight through her heated fury, wringing a bitter, desperate cry from her throat as the sheer weight of her husband's betrayal settles in. Her divine aura violently flares, causing her grand marble palace to shudder, as if struck by a primordial earthquake. Massive stone pillars sway like dazed men, ceiling dust rains down like ash, and the floor shakes with a terrifying violence. To a being of her stature, reducing an immortal sanctuary to rubble takes no more effort than tearing a fragile parchment. Just as her power threatens to bring the roof down upon her weeping servants, a single, composed voice cuts through the chaos like a cold iron blade. The shaking instantly ceases as the goddess of wisdom, Athena, steps into the dust-filled room, wearing a calm, almost mocking smile that forces the enraged bride to freeze. Athena announces herself as an unexpected messenger, carrying word from the highest court. Far from the crumbling palace, a magnificent grand feast is being prepared beside marble fountains flowing with dark, blood-red wine. Tables groan under piles of divine ambrosia, setting the stage for Olympus's grandest, most decadently corrupt tradition. Every 10 days, the gods gather to gorge themselves into a stupor, a deliberate, intoxicating trap devised by Zeus to keep his bored, chaotic brethren too intoxicated to meddle in the fragile affairs of mortals. And it is right into this sea of gluttony, gossip, and hidden schemes that the abandoned bride is now being summoned. The sprawling divine banquet hall glimmers with opulence, a gilded cage built by the king of the gods to keep his unpredictable pantheon distracted with endless wine and decadence. Yet, as the court gathers in all their indulgent glory, every eye turns toward the newly wedded goddess of love. Draped in exquisite woven silk and adorned with shimmering gold and fresh red roses, her breathtaking beauty leaves mortals and gods alike spellbound. Beneath the radiant facade, however, a dark, icy tension grips her posture. While lesser deities whisper praises and trade envious rumors, the sharper observers notice her cold, unyielding scowl. Public admiration is as effortless as breath to her, but tonight, the grand hall feels suffocating, because the one throne that should be occupied beside her remains completely empty. Her husband is nowhere to be seen. The promise that he would appear at the feast dissolves into another cruel illusion, feeding a dark, destructive impulse deep within her chest. She catches herself daydreaming of marching straight to his isolated forge, shattering those impenetrable iron gates, collapsing the stone walls, and crushing his cherished anvil into dust, so he would have nowhere left to hide from her. Just as her dark fantasy threatens to spill into reality, Athena steps beside her, casually pulling her into the shadowy periphery of the grand hall. With a sharp, knowing gaze, the goddess of wisdom immediately cuts through her defensiveness, effortlessly reading the violent thoughts swirling behind her eyes. Athena quietly reminds her that the blacksmith god is bound by an ancient, unbreakable pact with Zeus himself, a magical contract that pulls him away from his own life whenever the Sky King demands his craft. Recalling how she bitterly cursed both her husband and the king of gods when Athena first brought news of his forced departure, the abandoned bride feels her fragile patience snapping. She has curbed her volatile nature more than ever before in her immortal existence, waiting in silent agony while he remains locked away in his blazing sanctuary. As Athena attempts to plead for understanding and soften the blow on her father's behalf, the goddess of love cuts her off with a sharp, dangerous whisper, warning her that even a god's patience has its absolute limits. Dismissing Athena with a sharp flick of her wrist, the goddess of love turns her gaze toward the distant sanctuary, biting the inside of her lip as her remaining patience wears dangerously thin. She silently demands the universe to surrender the man who abandoned her, and as if in answer to her unspoken cry, a low, familiar rumble breaks the heavy silence behind her. Turning sharply, her eyes land on the master craftsman. Unchanged, unbothered, and entirely unadorned, he stands amidst the glittering, jewelry-laden court in plain black garb and a long, rugged chestnut coat, standing out precisely because he refuses to play into the vanity of Olympus. Aphrodite's heart leaps with a mixture of profound relief and simmering resentment, bitter that she didn't spot him sooner. Arming herself with sarcastic venom, she scoffs, asking if he was merely a stray guest who attended her wedding, expecting him to break into panicked apologies or beg for her divine mercy. Instead, he simply stands there with an unreadable, stoic calm, answering her biting rhetorical questions with a literal, earnest sincerity that leaves her utterly speechless. When he quietly asks to speak in private, she holds out, refusing to give ground, until a subtle, desperate edge in his voice catches her off guard. When he reaches out his massive, calloused hand, she takes it despite her pride, feeling the intense, radiant heat of his palm instantly melt her defensive armor, a comforting warmth that maddens her because she finds herself completely unable to pull away. He leads her into a dark, secluded alcove, a labyrinth of shadow, stone, and interlocking pillars where neither light nor wind can penetrate. Recognizing the eerie stillness, she notes that it feels like a hidden refuge, prompting a quiet confession from the blacksmith that he once used this very corner to hide from the rest of the world. Gentle despite his towering frame, he removes his thick chestnut coat and spreads it across the cold stone for her to sit on. As she settles into the plush, magic-laced fabric, her senses are immediately enveloped by his distinct, ember-warm scent, softening her expression before she quickly forces back her scowl. Expecting a long, drawn-out debate, she is struck silent as the stoic god looks down at her and delivers a swift, deeply sincere apology, admitting that abandoning her on the morning after their wedding night was a grave wrong he could only confess in the quiet shadows. The goddess of love had sworn to tear the heavens apart and make her distant husband bleed tears of regret for leaving her bed, yet standing before him in the shadowed alcove, her fierce vows of vengeance melt like morning frost. On Mount Olympus, apologies are weaponized tools of deceit, traded by smooth-tongued narcissists who would sooner burn a city than admit a fault. But as the Titan-forged god stammers his low, clumsy regret with downcast eyes, she realizes with a dawning sense of awe that his remorse is entirely, terrifyingly real. A dangerous softness settles in her chest. She adopts a haughty, regal posture to hide her relief, scolding him like a wayward servant and demanding a binding promise that he will never vanish from her side again. She expects him to bow, to grovel, to pledge his eternal obedience to her divine whims. Instead, the solemn blacksmith looks her dead in the eye and plainly refuses. The rejection hits her like an icy splash of water. Stunned into disbelief, she attempts to rewrite his words, offering him an escape route, but he stands his ground with brutal, unvarnished honesty. He calmly explains that he would rather bear her immediate, scorching wrath than offer a fake promise he is destined to break. His loyalty is bound to an ancient, binding pact with Zeus, a heavy obligation that overrides his own personal life whenever the king of gods demands his hammer. When she angrily snaps that he is acting more like a disposable servant than a lord of fire, he patiently corrects her, revealing that the arrangement benefits him as well. In fact, he admits with painful sincerity that Zeus actually granted him a rare, merciful exception just to allow them their wedding night together, an exception made necessary because her unexpected visit to his forge days earlier had severely delayed his mandatory workload. The realization that her own vanity and sudden intrusion caused his forced disappearance sends a hot blush of humiliation rushing to her cheeks. Caught off guard, she lashes out with defensive pride, demanding why he didn't simply throw her out of his sanctuary if she was in the way. But deep down, the emotional armor around her heart begins to crack, realizing that the stoic husband she tried so hard to hate holds a quiet, unyielding honesty that both maddens and draws her in. A heavy, suffocating quiet settles inside the shadowy alcove. Her bite-sized defensive anger falls completely flat against his immovable, patient demeanor. He offers no sharp rebuke, no rising anger to match her heat, only a low, flat truth that cuts deeper than any insult. To him, the hammer and the anvil are not merely tools or chores, but the very core of his identity. A god of the forge without his fire is no different than the goddess of beauty losing her capacity for love. His words hit her like an impenetrable wall. Surrounding his heart is a massive, silent fortress, locked tighter than an ancient shell. Every spirit, mortal, and deity in the cosmos opens their soul to her at a single glance, yet her own husband remains entirely immune to her supernatural pull. She glares at his stoic silhouette, maddened by a terrifying realization. If she turned on her heel and walked away right now, he would simply let her leave without uttering a single word to stop her. Desperation wrings a rare, fragile vulnerability from her proud lips. She asks where she is supposed to go, where she belongs while he spends his days slaving away for the rest of Olympus. She commands a legion of devoted nymphs and holds the obsessive adoration of countless gods, yet in this dark corner, she would trade every jewel in her sanctuary just to have him stand by her side. She swallows her legendary pride, whispering that she will be left completely alone. His reply comes like a quiet, crushing blow. He tells her plainly to stay where she is adored, among the light, the beauty, and the delicate things that suit her, anywhere far away from the harsh soot, deafening noise, and blistering heat of his forge. A subtle, pain twitch pulls at the corner of his stone-like mouth, revealing the quiet agony behind his words. He is not mocking her. He is drawing a firm, unyielding boundary between their worlds. The truth settles in with cold, devastating clarity. He is rejecting her. For the first time in her immortal existence, the goddess of irresistible desire is pushed away by the very god deemed the least handsome, the least refined, and the most isolated of his kind. When she bitterly declares that she will never accept his apology nor forgive his absence, she stands with her back turned, holding her breath, silently begging him to break his stoic silence, to beg for her grace, to promise he will change. Instead, his low voice carries only a final, heartbreaking sorrow, apologizing one last time because he has nothing left to give. Tears of wounded pride and burning frustration well in her eyes as she turns and flees into the shimmering light of the feast. But deep within her shattered ego, a dark, vengeful vow takes root. If he refuses to let her into his world, she will unleash a chaotic storm across Olympus that will force the master craftsman to drop his hammer and face her. A heavy, suffocating quiet settles inside the shadowy alcove. Her bite-sized defensive anger falls completely flat against his immovable, patient demeanor. He offers no sharp rebuke, no rising anger to match her heat, only a low, flat truth that cuts deeper than any insult. To him, the hammer and the anvil are not merely tools or chores, but the very core of his identity. A god of the forge without his fire is no different than the goddess of beauty losing her capacity for love. His words hit her like an impenetrable wall. Surrounding his heart is a massive, silent fortress, locked tighter than an ancient shell. Every spirit, mortal, and deity in the cosmos opens their soul to her at a single glance, yet her own husband remains entirely immune to her supernatural pull. She glares at his stoic silhouette, maddened by a terrifying realization. If she turned on her heel and walked away right now, he would simply let her leave without uttering a single word to stop her. Desperation wrings a rare, fragile vulnerability from her proud lips. She asks where she is supposed to go, where she belongs while he spends his days slaving away for the rest of Olympus. She commands a legion of devoted nymphs and holds the obsessive adoration of countless gods, yet in this dark corner, she would trade every jewel in her sanctuary just to have him stand by her side. She swallows her legendary pride, whispering that she will be left completely alone. His reply comes like a quiet, crushing blow. He tells her plainly to stay where she is adored, among the light, the beauty, and the delicate things that suit her, anywhere far away from the harsh soot, deafening noise, and blistering heat of his forge. A subtle, pain twitch pulls at the corner of his stone-like mouth, revealing the quiet agony behind his words. He is not mocking her. He is drawing a firm, unyielding boundary between their worlds. The truth settles in with cold, devastating clarity. He is rejecting her. For the first time in her immortal existence, the goddess of irresistible desire is pushed away by the very god deemed the least handsome, the least refined, and the most isolated of his kind. When she bitterly declares that she will never accept his apology nor forgive his absence, she stands with her back turned, holding her breath, silently begging him to break his stoic silence, to beg for her grace, to promise he will change. Instead, his low voice carries only a final, heartbreaking sorrow, apologizing one last time because he has nothing left to give. Tears of wounded pride and burning frustration well in her eyes as she turns and flees into the shimmering light of the feast. But deep within her shattered ego, a dark, vengeful vow takes root. If he refuses to let her into his world, she will unleash a chaotic storm across Olympus that will force the master craftsman to drop his hammer and face her. The god of war narrows his eyes, a sinister grin breaking across his flushed face as she dangerously whispers that her private sanctuary was the exact location of her first night as a bride. Driven by bitter rivalry toward his stepbrother and fueled by his own reckless lust, he takes the bait completely, grabbing her with violent, unpolished hunger and dragging her toward his dark mount. His idea of passion, however, proves to be a brutal, clumsy nightmare. His hands scratch her pale skin, and his rough teeth leave harsh, painful marks, far removed from the delicate, lingering touch of a true lover. As his hands push against her unyielding frame, she gasps in pained shock, realizing with mounting disgust that his aggressive foreplay holds no genuine tenderness or skill, only the selfish, animalistic urges of a brute. He mistakes her soft gasps for pleasure, arrogantly smirking as he commands her body. But the moment he speaks, urging her to cry out louder to feed his inflated ego, a cold wave of psychological revulsion washes over her. Sitting beneath this perfectly sculpted warrior, she realizes there is no one in the universe uglier than the man before her now. He cares nothing for her pleasure or connection, viewing her merely as another battlefield to conquer, another trophy to plunder for his own boastful pride. Her mind races as the tragic truth sets in. Just as he brings devastation and war to the mortal realm for his own bloody glory, he approaches love with the same selfish, destructive arrogance. Disgusted by his slobbering, self-centered attempts to taint the sacred nature of desire, her longing for her silent, genuine husband roars back with fiery intensity. When the warlord attempts to force himself closer, she snaps, planting her hands against his chiseled chest and pulling her knees to her body. She violently kicks him off with all her divine strength, sending him crashing back in stunned confusion. Glaring at him with cold, terrifying disdain, she commands him to get out and never touch her again, discarding the arrogant war god like trash as her chaotic scheme explodes around her. The god of war snarls with wounded pride, blood-red fire flashing in his eyes as he realizes he has been discarded like an unwanted tool. Yet unlike the deep, hypnotic embers of her husband's gaze, this raw, chaotic flame leaves her completely cold, offering no temptation, no warmth, and no desire to linger. She watches with cold detachment as he curses, violently kicking her stone pillars in a temper tantrum that shakes the very foundations of her palace, terrifying her waiting nymphs. He stomps away toward his dark stallion, casting a desperate, pathetic glance over his shoulder in hopes of a second chance, only to be met with her frozen, disgusted glare. Her relief at his departure is short-lived as she spots his forgotten dagger gleaming on the cold marble floor. Hurrying after him to toss the weapon back, she watches him ride off in a cloud of shattered stone, but as she turns back toward her private courtyard, her eyes lock onto a blonde, wide-eyed youth cowering in the shadows. It is a young servant of Apollo, pale with terror, clutching his mouth after witnessing the god of war storm out of the love goddess's intimate quarters. Seeing the trembling boy on the verge of tears, Aphrodite feels a fleeting flicker of pity for his delicate beauty, but her predatory instinct quickly overpowers her mercy. This clumsy, accidental witness is the precise spark her vengeful scheme requires. Approaching the terrified servant, she traps him in her gaze, ignoring his stuttered pleas of innocence. With practiced, intoxicating divinity, she reaches out, gently cupping his chin and weaving a subtle, hypnotic web over his fragile mind. Slowly, the boy's vivid blue eyes cloud over, his resistance crumbling as she rewrites his memories, forcing him to believe his own master sent him as a secret spy. The simple sight of a hasty departure is far too weak to ignite the divine court. To force her blacksmith husband away from his forge, she needs a blinding, uncontrollable wildfire of scandal. Leaning close to the enchanted boy's ear, her warm breath carrying a deadly, hypnotic command, she whispers a twisted, exaggerated version of the encounter, instructing him to carry the scandalous lie straight to Apollo and spread the explosive rumor to every corner of Mount Olympus. The forged scandal sweeps across Mount Olympus like a ravenous wildfire, transformed by the gossiping court into an intoxicating, illicit romance. Whispers fill every grand hall and shadowy column, telling of secret, passionate encounters between the goddess of desire and the ruthless god of war, a steamy affair so intense that the warlord supposedly bestowed his prized blade upon her as a token of his devotion. Inside her private chambers, her worried nymphs crowd around in near tears, desperately asking how to handle the invasive, prying questions. Hidden beneath a cool, serene facade, her heart dances with dark, triumphant laughter. She dismisses their anxiety with practiced, queenly composure, instructing them to ignore the baseless rumors. Yet the moment the doors close, she uncorking a vintage bottle of divine nectar to celebrate her flawless psychological trap. Her victory sip is abruptly cut short as a terrified nymph peeks back into the room, delivering a summons that sends a chill through her veins. The formidable queen of the gods, Hera, demands her immediate presence. While she anticipated a confrontation, she never expected the terrifying matriarch to react before her distant husband even had a chance to hear the rumors. Faced with a royal summons, she casually tilts her glass, pouring the rich, amber wine onto the pristine marble floor, watching the dark liquid pool and spread like a fresh wound on pale skin. Dressing in her finest attire, she ascends to the royal sanctuary, finding the queen perched on her throne, radiating cold, menacing authority capable of cowing even the ruler of the skies. Attempting to shield herself with aloof arrogance, she casually crosses her arms, demanding a place to sit and feigning total ignorance. But the queen's knuckles turn white as her fingers grip the stone arms of her throne. Her voice drops into a terrifying, icy snarl that shatters the room's tense silence, reminding the bride of the lethal warning given on her wedding night, ordering her never to lay a finger on her favored son. The tension inside the grand hall thickens into a suffocating, heavy air as two divine egos clash in a dangerous game of psychological warfare. Standing before the regal matriarch, the goddess of love expected a sharp reprimand for the scandalous rumors flooding the court. What she never anticipated was the venomous turn the queen's tirade would take, dragging the absent blacksmith's very existence into the mud. The queen sneers with bitter disgust, accusing her daughter-in-law of treating her favored warrior son like a common rag, simply because she could not stomach the so-called ugliness of her wedded husband. Those spat words ignite a sudden, furious defense inside the love goddess. To her, the god of the forge was never hideous. His rugged, stone-like features held a raw, undeniable weight that no other deity possessed. To hear his own mother spit such venom reveals a toxic, deep-seated hatred that chills the court to its core. Driven by a sudden urge to strike back, she weaponizes the bitter truth, mockingly suggesting that if the blacksmith truly inherited such unpleasant traits, he could only have received them from the mother who bore him alone. The verbal strike lands with terrifying precision, hitting the queen's proud heart where it hurts most. The matriarch's eyes bulge with incredulous rage as this bold defiance shatters her absolute authority. The argument devolves into a razor-sharp exchange of insults. Every attempt by the elder queen to pull rank and demand obedience is met with ringing, mocking laughter. The goddess of beauty refuses to bow, pointing out the hypocrisy of a ruler who speaks like a street brawler, only to hide behind her royal title the moment her pride is wounded. She coldly advises the trembling queen to gaze into a mirror before daring to call anyone else hideous. A suffocating, dangerous quiet falls across the throne room as the queen stands frozen in pure, unadulterated shock. Her jaw tightens, her face turning pale as the unbearable insult sinks into her soul. For a fleeting second, the victorious bride believes she has completely broken her mother-in-law's spirit, until her eyes lock onto the queen's trembling hand, slowly reaching down to grasp a heavy, divine object on the arm of her throne. The sharp crack of leather breaks the tense silence, as the royal matriarch violently lashes out with a heavy horsewhip, catching the beauty goddess off guard before her divine reflexes can react. In the quiet sanctuary of her private chambers, the radiant sun god gently applies a soothing salve to the fresh, red welts on her fair skin. Clicking his tongue in mild scolding, he warns her that mocking the royal matriarch's delicate ego was a dangerous game. Yet beneath his calm, medical demeanor, she sees through him completely, knowing he secretly took satisfaction in seeing her proud nature humbled by the whip. After all, he willingly allowed his young servant to spread the scandalous rumors about her and the god of war across the realm. She snaps at him to finish his work and leave, nursing a bitter ache in her heart that goes far deeper than physical cuts. The scandalous rumor of her betrayal has echoed into every corner of the realm, bringing royal reprimands and divine interference. Yet from her quiet, distant husband, there has been absolute silence. Not a single whisper, not a single sign of anger or jealousy, leaving her to wonder if the master craftsman even cares that his bride has seemingly fallen into another's arms. Sensing her dark mood, the solar deity gathers his tools to depart. Though he holds no affection for her wild, uninhibited ways and constantly seeks to curry favor with the strict queen, he pauses at the threshold. In a rare, quiet moment of genuine honesty, he admits that while he will never apologize for his own part in the gossip, he secretly admired her ruthless bravery. She voiced the deadly, forbidden truths about the queen that no other deity in the realm would ever dare to whisper. With those cryptic words, he vanishes into thin air, leaving the wounded bride alone in the quiet shadows of her room, nursing her bruised body and a burning, obsessive question. How far must she push this dangerous game before the silent blacksmith finally drops his heavy hammer and comes to claim what is his? The blacksmith stands there like a silent mountain, his heavy voice trembling with a rare, desperate tenderness as he asks after his wounded bride. Hearing that the physical marks of the lash have already vanished, the god of fire does not look relieved. Instead, a dark, heavy shadow falls across his features. He quietly reveals a terrifying truth that makes the sun god's blood run cold. The royal matriarch's whip is laced with a cruel, ancient magic, leaving wounds that seem healed to the eye, while the excruciating agony continues to burn deep beneath the flesh. A suffocating silence settles over the grand hallway, as the sun deity suddenly realizes how the blacksmith knows such a horrific detail. Long before he became a legendary worker of bronze and iron, a helpless, unwanted child felt that very same leather tear into his own skin. The realization hits like a brutal blow, exposing the tragic, hidden trauma that shaped the smith's cold and distant soul. Learned from a lifetime of neglect, he expects nothing from anyone, guarding his heart behind an impenetrable wall of stoic isolation. Yet despite the bitter betrayal of the recent scandal, the gentle giant offers no anger, no harsh words, and no demands. He merely swallows his own past pain, softly pleading with the physician to ensure the beauty goddess suffers no lingering torment. As the sun god departs on his golden chariot, an unsettling question lingers in the cool air. The master craftsman stood just steps away from his bride's bedchamber, filled with quiet, agonizing worry for her pain, yet he refused to cross the threshold to see her face, leaving her to nurse her burning wounds in solitary darkness. The divine court has transformed into a stage of wild, reckless indulgence, where the radiant goddess of love holds lavish banquets almost every evening, surrounding herself with eager onlookers, eager to consume the delicious scandal dripping from her every move. The halls whisper with rumors of a perilous triangle, featuring a strikingly handsome human youth brought from her earthly sanctuary and the hot-tempered war god himself. The gossiping court watches with breathless fascination, assuming the boy is being sent away to save his life from the war deity's deadly jealousy. They whisper that the beauty goddess has finally given in to the warlord's relentless, almost desperate wooing. Little do they know, the boy is merely a cherished godchild, and the rumor is nothing more than another layer in her dangerous, calculated game. She secretly sneers at the war god's pathetic persistence. Despite him storming off before, he continues to shadow her every step, offering hollow promises of protection against his royal mother's wrath. Yet beneath her outward laughter and grand displays, a dark, poisonous frustration festers deep inside her soul. The grand scandal of her supposed infidelity has echoed to the furthest corners of the realm, yet the one man she truly seeks to provoke remains completely undisturbed. Whispers from the Grand Forge reveal that her husband calmly dismissed the rumors, coldly declaring that his sacred craft was far more important than his wife's wild affairs. Hearing of his total indifference makes her blood boil with dangerous intensity. She had rehearsed every fiery argument, every sharp retort, and every cruel insult for the moment he would come charging in to claim her, but her crafted trap sits empty. Her pride bleeds from his silent detachment, igniting an obsessive, uncontrollable fire within her. She will push this twisted game to its absolute limit, doing whatever it takes to break his steel facade and force the quiet blacksmith to finally bleed. Even surrounded by the lavish music and flowing nectar of her nightly revelries, the goddess of love remains trapped inside her own mind, constantly haunted by the silent husband who refuses to notice her. Playing the role of the war god's clandestine lover had become strange, comforting distraction, keeping her dark nightmares of the blacksmith at bay. So when the relentless warlord fails to show up before her grand banquet, a subtle prickle of annoyance disturbs her calm. Escaping the loud, intoxicated crowd, she slips into the quiet, moonlit corridors of her palace, only to be swept off her feet by a pair of heavy, familiar arms. Expecting the warlord's usual arrogant temper, she is unnerved by his unnerving, relaxed grin. He acts humble, teasingly asking if she missed him, an attitude so unnaturally sweet that she suspects a shape-shifting prankster in disguise. Yet as he bursts into boisterous laughter, a gleaming royal medallion catches the light, confirming that this insufferable, self-centered narcissist is indeed the god of war. Tucking the crest beneath his mantle, he eagerly pulls her along to reveal a grand surprise, an apology for his tardiness. He leads her through the fragrant, secluded groves to the crest of a gentle hill, revealing a pristine pavilion built of flawless white marble and burnished gold. Resting in the very center of the open-air sanctuary, framed by lush floral bushes, sits a magnificent, gilded bed draped in the finest silks, structured like the bottom of an opulent birdcage. Though her proud heart refuses to give him the satisfaction of excessive praise, she is quietly captivated by the sheer craft of the sanctuary. Yet a strange, subtle chill settles over her skin. The architecture is undeniably breathtaking, but the intricate ironwork and flawless gold accents feel disturbingly unfamiliar for this part of the realm. It is a masterpiece that seems to have materialized out of nowhere, silently waiting on the hilltop. The warlord proudly boasts that he had his scouts claim the secluded hideaway the moment it appeared, completely oblivious to the silent, invisible thread tightening around them. As she steps under the shadow of the golden cage, a haunting, lingering presence fills the air, leaving a quiet, cryptic suspicion. Was this romantic retreat truly a gift from a courting warlord, or a meticulously forged trap, built by a silent blacksmith who has been watching them all along? Step into the shadowed groves of Mount Olympus, where the moonlight casts a golden glow over a secluded marble pavilion. The god of war, driven by unyielding desire, pulls the radiant goddess of love toward a grand, open-air bed. He boasts of his unwavering devotion, making grandiose promises that even the most cynical heart could not completely ignore. Yet as she reclines into the luxurious silks, her thoughts remain miles away, anchored to a quiet, distant blacksmith. Surrounded by a world of deities willing to tear down heaven itself just to win her favor, the only man who truly matters continues to offer nothing but cold, maddening silence. Fueled by a bitter resolve to shatter his detachment once and for all, she surrenders to the moment, letting the dark, crimson eyes of the warlord consume her vision. Suddenly, a deafening roar shatters the midnight calm. The ground trembles as intricate, thread-like bars erupt from the gilded bed frame, instantly weaving into a formidable, unbreakable cage. The warlord leaps up, striking the metallic net with brutal, world-shaking force, but the miraculous craft refuses to yield even a fraction of an inch. While the warlord fumes in helpless rage, a sudden surge of pure, intoxicating joy floods the beauty goddess's heart. She recognizes the masterwork immediately. Only one divine hand could forge metal so fine that it flows like silk, yet holds strength greater than the gods themselves. He knew, he cared, he built this magnificent trap, orchestrating every detail just to catch her. Footsteps crunch against the fallen leaves as the divine court emerges from the dark forest. Leading the assembly of shocked and sneering deities is the master craftsman himself. Though the queen of the gods glares with murderous fury and the surrounding crowd whispers in harsh condemnation, the beauty goddess sees no one else. She locks eyes with her silent husband, intoxicated by the realization that behind his cold, impenetrable exterior burns a fire possessive enough to capture her for the whole world to see. Under the heavy weight of the divine court's stunned gaze, the master craftsman reaches into his miraculous metallic web, effortlessly drawing his wife out from the golden trap. He retrieves her fallen mantle, wrapping her trembling body with protective, deliberate care. Deep inside, the goddess of beauty surrenders completely to the overwhelming rush of thrill surging through her veins, burying her face into his solid chest, overflowing with an intoxicating delight she never felt in the arms of the war god. With cold authority that shocks even the sovereign king of the realm, the blacksmith refuses to linger for petty trials or grand speeches. Hoisting his bride into his arms, he carries her away from the gaping audience, embarking on a long, unyielding march toward his secluded fortress. For the beauty goddess, time dissolves into a hazy blur until the grand, imposing iron gates of his private sanctuary swing open. Before his bewildered servants, the forge master issues a stern, forbidding decree: absolute isolation. Anyone attempting to breach his threshold will face a dark, inescapable curse in his divine name. The sudden display of possessive, dominant fire in a husband she once dismissed as cold and passive electrifies her very soul. Stepping into the heavy quiet of his bedchamber, she lets her mantle slide to the cold floor, standing exposed before him. The blacksmith does not turn away. His dark eyes sweep over every curve of her form with the sharp, meticulous intensity of a master sculptor assessing raw, unblemished marble. Without a single physical touch, his piercing gaze ignites a searing, breathless sensation that makes her skin flush and her breath catch. He breaks the heavy silence with a low, cryptic question, asking if she truly has nothing to say for herself. When she offers only a teasing, mischievous smile, he turns silently toward a small chest, retrieving a pair of uniquely forged metal bands bound by a short, unbreakable chain. As he fastens them onto her wrists, the cold iron seems to melt like liquid before snapping tight against her skin, leaving her completely helpless. When she breathlessly inquires what fate awaits her, the silent craftsman leans in, whispering a quiet, Dark promise that he is about to give her precisely what she has been yearning for all along, leaving her suspended between fear, desire, and the mysterious edge of total surrender. Inside the quiet sanctuary of the heavy iron bedchamber, the master craftsman twists his wife's hands behind her back, securing her wrists in unbreakable, fluid metal bands. Surprised by the sudden constraint, she squirms against the silken sheets, helpless as a delicate bird resting atop his lap. The goddess of beauty, accustomed to commanding the hearts of gods and mortals alike, finds herself utterly disarmed by his cool, methodical authority. When she attempts to object, long, calloused fingers slide gently along the inside of her soft thigh, drawing a sharp, involuntary gasp from her lips. Sensing her body's immediate, overwhelming response, a faint, knowing shadow passes across the craftsman's face. His voice drops to a biting, icy whisper, asking if the war god ever laid hands upon her, if he ever dared to touch her in the dark. She remains silent, knowing that while the warlord brought only rough, painful moments, the quiet husband before her holds a far deeper, far more terrifying power over her senses. Unfazed by her silence, he reveals a specialized creation, a delicate, shimmering golden chain adorned with smooth, bead-like spheres. He wraps the cool metal around her waist, guiding the intricate artifact precisely against her skin. The sensation of the cold iron against her flushed skin sparks a wave of intense, mounting anticipation. With a subtle touch of his divine craft, the golden chain springs to life, vibrating with a soft, rhythmic hum that sends overwhelming shockwaves through her core. The more she shifts and turns, the more the delicate mechanism strokes her most sensitive spots, driving her breath into ragged, breathless gasps. Not content with the artifact's magic alone, the Forge Master deepens his touch, matching the artifact's pulse with his own deliberate hands. The intoxicating fusion of ancient craft and physical desire sweeps away every lingering thought, every clever argument, and every shred of pride. All her thoughts dissolve into complete, blinding euphoria. She buries her face into the soft bed, surrendering completely to the overwhelming waves of sensation, until the boundary between pleasure and torment vanishes, and her conscious world fades into brilliant, shadowy darkness. As the cool night air settles outside the iron walls, inside the Forge Master's private chamber, time seems to bend under the weight of sheer, feverish desire. Though they had shared the intimate grace of marriage only once before, the blacksmith possesses an unsettling, precise memory of her every weakness, stroke by deliberate stroke, sending waves of liquid fire surging through her core. The golden spheres continue their rhythmic, mechanical pulse, working in mesmerizing harmony with his calloused hands. Amidst her breathless gaspings, his voice cuts through the shadows with a calm, almost chilling detachment. He murmurs an apology, suggesting that her wild scandals were merely the result of his own failures as a husband, believing he could never truly satisfy her heart. The absurdity of his quiet insecurity strikes her like a sudden blow. She desperately tries to speak, to shatter his false logic and tell him the truth, but her words dissolve into incoherent, gasping moans as he deepens his touch, ignoring her attempts to explain. He strokes her skin with meticulous precision, like a quiet artisan lost in his work, entirely focused on driving her to the very brink of surrender. Bound, helpless, and exposed upon his lap, any other woman might feel the sting of humiliation, yet the goddess of beauty feels only an overwhelming, intoxicating thrill. Her body instinctively moves to match his rhythm, surrendering completely to the possessive storm he has unleashed. She realizes that beneath his cold, stoic facade, a dark, possessive fire burns exclusively for her. For a goddess whose very essence demands adoration, knowing she has finally driven the untouchable smith to jealousy is the ultimate triumph. Yet, despite the dizzying peaks of ecstasy his hands provide, a deeper, sharper hunger begins to consume her. An intricate machine and skillful fingers are no longer enough. She remembers the profound weight of their first union, and her heart craves something far more raw, far more complete than clever mechanisms. Gathering every ounce of her remaining strength, she tightens her body to reject his touch, commanding him to stop. When the blacksmith pauses in quiet surprise, asking if she has truly reached her limit, she turns her flushed face toward his, her eyes blazing with raw, unyielding demand. She boldly rejects his crafted tools, demanding the full, unreserved presence of the man himself, rubbing her bound frame against him, leaving the quiet master of bronze and iron completely stunned by her wild, unexpected demand. Beneath the heavy fold of his simple robes, a distinct, undeniable strain betrays the blacksmith's hidden composure. A musky, primal warmth fills the quiet air of the bedchamber, leaving the goddess of love with no doubt about the fierce hunger he attempts to conceal behind his stoic mask. When she teasingly nods toward his obvious desire, commanding him to release it, he hesitates, muttering quietly that he could never give her what she truly craves. Annoyed by his endless, maddening self-doubt, she leans forward, using her lips to pull away the fabric hiding his unyielding strength. Ignoring his breathless protests, she surrenders entirely to instinct, taking him into her mouth, tasting the salty, intoxicating heat of his raw essence. He gasps, his hands trembling as he gently, yet firmly pulls her face away, staring into her eyes with a dark, burning intensity. In a rough, gravelly whisper, he asks if she ever performed such intimate surrender for the god of war. The question almost makes her laugh aloud. For a goddess who always demanded to be worshipped and served by every lover, the thought of bowing before anyone other than her silent husband was utterly unthinkable. The grand scandal was merely a desperate play for his attention, a truth he still fails to comprehend. To quiet his wounded pride, she licks the tips of his fingers, whispering softly that no other male in existence has ever tasted such devotion from her lips. Her confession shatters the final remnant of his rigid self-control. Without another word, his calloused hands lift her weightless frame, shifting her across the silk covers. Without warning, he drives his iron strength deep into her core. Her breath hitches, a sharp scream caught against the soft pillows, as a dizzying mix of intense pain and overwhelming euphoria floods her senses. He does not rush. Each deep, deliberate thrust is calculated to reach the very depths of her soul, claiming every inch of her bound, helpless form. Unable to use her restrained hands to guide his rhythm, she arches her hips backward, meeting his forceful momentum with wild, unreserved passion. A cruel, triumphant grin passes over his lips as his hands lock around her waist, anchoring her to his relentless pace. Warm drops of his sweat rain down upon her bare back, an irresistible proof of his complete, unbridled surrender to her body. Shaking off the pillow, she cries out into the shadows of the forge, begging him to push deeper, deeper still, until the line between master and captive vanishes completely into the night. The intense, overwhelming friction inside the quiet bedchamber reaches a feverish crescendo as the goddess of love surrenders completely, using every fiber of her divine essence to draw her husband into the ultimate release. The master craftsman lets out a low, breathless groan that shakes the silent hall, his powerful grip tightening around her waist as he plunges into the deepest depths of her soul. The sensation is unlike anything she has ever known, sweeping away every lingering thought, every carefully crafted scheme, and every shred of pride. Boundless waves of ecstasy wash over her until her mind goes dark, her final conscious thought begging for the fiery storm never to end. When consciousness slowly trickles back like a gentle stream, she opens her heavy eyes to find a thick, muscular arm wrapped securely around her waist, anchoring her to his chest throughout the night. Yet as her senses awaken, a thrilling, unexpected realization sends a shudder through her core. The blacksmith never withdrew, remaining joined with her even in slumber. She curses softly beneath her breath, marveling at the intense intimacy she had schemed so recklessly to find. As her body instinctively responds to his lingering warmth, his heavy hand moves gently over her flushed skin, sensing her immediate, unreserved desire. When he begins to pull back, she breathlessly demands that he remain, proposing they take control on her terms this time. Yet without a word, The forge master effortlessly hoists her onto his shoulder, carrying his exquisite prisoner away from the silken sheets. He brings her to a hidden, steaming sanctuary beneath his fortress, where bubbling waters warmed by the subterranean fires of Mount Etna fill a pristine stone pool. Sinking into the soothing, magical thermal spring, her exhausted frame melts into the restorative heat. Closing her eyes in pure bliss, she hums a quiet melody into the mist, oblivious to the quiet, searching gaze of her husband, who watches her with a lingering, unspoken yearning, hoping for a sign of love he fears he may never truly hold. 15 days and 15 nights pass in this shadowy, exquisite captivity, bound not by iron bars, but by an unending tempest of desire. The beauty goddess realizes she is the most fortunate prisoner in all of the realm, trapped forever in the fiery embrace of a silent blacksmith. Inside the secluded fortress, the passage of time dissolves into a shimmering, intoxicating haze. Delicate, ring-shaped artifacts of silver and bronze clip onto her most sensitive flesh, tightening with soft, precise pressure that leaves the goddess of beauty trembling, gasping for breath in the heavy quiet. She marvels at the brilliant, dark ironies of her existence. The very hands that forged thunderbolts and impenetrable armor for the divine court are now devoted entirely to crafting intricate instruments for her private pleasure. The chair of restraint, the platinum rod, artificial lips and tongues of soft leather that mimic breathless kisses, every device built to ignite a wildfire beneath her skin. Yet, despite the dizzying, endless waves of ecstasy, a deep, aching emptiness lingers in her heart. For 2 weeks, the silent craftsman has given her everything, except himself. He uses every brilliant creation in his repertoire, yet stubbornly refuses to yield his own body to her waiting embrace. When she begs him with tears spilling down her flushed cheeks, pleading for his true warmth, he merely offers another mechanical masterpiece, murmuring with heartbreaking insecurity that he lacks the confidence to truly satisfy her. No matter how passionately she reassures him, his deep-seated self-doubt acts as an unbreakable barrier, forcing him to hide behind his own marvelous inventions. After an exhausting session that leaves her utterly spent, he carries her to the steaming sanctuary of the subterranean spring. As she floats in the thermal waters, he asks if the latest artifact brought her joy. Annoyed by his dense, stubborn refusal to understand her true desire, she sharply retorts that his creation felt far too small, completely inferior to the real man. The blacksmith simply argues that his measurements are mathematically flawless, completely blind to the subtle, romantic flirtation in her voice. With a soft, cryptic whisper promising he will return, he slips into the mist, leaving her sighing in the warm water, yearning for the one thing his magnificent forge cannot replicate. Later, as she drifts in a deep, peaceful slumber, a harsh, frantic hand shakes her shoulder. She opens her groggy eyes, expecting the gentle, heavy presence of her husband, but finds instead the piercing red glare of the war god. The warlord boasts of sneaking past the magical perimeter, urging her to flee before her husband returns. He wildly promises to haul the blacksmith before the High King, claiming the entire divine realm is outraged over her cruel captivity. The beauty goddess stares at him in sheer disbelief. To the rest of the world, she is a helpless prisoner trapped in an iron fortress, but in reality, she is living through the most thrilling, deeply sensual weeks of her immortal life. Pulling her hand away from the war god's grip as if touching poison, she prepares to defend the sanctuary she never wants to leave. Inside the quiet hall of the secluded sanctuary, the war god continues his arrogant rant, completely blind to the cold disdain burning in the eyes of the beauty goddess. He sneers at her simple, unadorned robe, mistaking her post-bath relaxation for the outfit of a miserable captive. Reaching out with a confident hand, he offers to lead her away from her silent husband's kingdom, expecting tearful gratitude. Instead, she slaps his hand away like an annoying insect, declaring with razor-sharp clarity that he is the only unwanted intruder in her paradise. The warlord stammers in disbelief, boasting of how he humiliated himself before the High Queen, begging for permission to claim her as his own, or to force an annulment of her marriage. Hearing his wildly delusional plans, a sharp, mocking laugh bursts from her lips. To a goddess who spent 2 weeks surrendering to the most intoxicating, creative passion of her existence, his unexpected rescue attempt is not just absurd, it is utterly pathetic. Securing her loose robe with a firm knot, she turns her back on him, ending the discussion. But the war god, having risked everything to trespass into forbidden territory, refuses to leave empty-handed. Closing the distance in 2 broad strides, he hauls her over his shoulder like a sack of grain. She kicks and screams, demanding to be set down, but he marches relentlessly toward the iron threshold. Terrified servants scatter in horror, trembling before the warlord's infamous wrath. When a brave attendant attempts to intervene, a burst of crimson flame erupts from the war god's hand, ready to reduce the helpless servant to ash. Before the lethal strike can land, a terrifying wall of dark, pitch-black fire surges up from the stone floor, swallowing the spell instantly. Relief washes over her as she twists the warlord's ear with all her strength, forcing him to drop her onto the floor. Dropping his arm, the war god sneers at the stoic craftsman, hurling bitter, cruel insults at his slow gait. Yet the blacksmith stands impassive, his dark eyes unreadable as he calmly asks why the warlord has dared to cross his threshold. Unsheathing his colossal blade, the war god leaps high into the air with a deafening bellow, bringing his steel down in a brutal, earth-shattering arc. The floor explodes in a blinding cloud of dust and debris, shaking the heavy foundation of the fortress. As the thick smoke slowly clears, she rushes to her husband's side, her heart pounding with frantic dread. Though the smith managed to avoid a direct, fatal blow, a dark, crimson river of blood spills through his thick hair, running down his temples in a silent, horrifying stream, leaving the goddess of love frozen in absolute terror. Before the heavy iron of the forge or the suffocating intrigue of the divine hall, there was only the vast, silent expanse of the void. Born from the drifting remnants of an ancient, fallen titan, a nameless sea maiden emerged from the endless blue, bound to a tragic inheritance. Her very first sensation was not warmth or joy, but a heavy, crushing loneliness that haunted her every breath. Trapped in an uncharted sea where neither god nor mortal dared to venture, she felt an intense, desperate yearning to escape the hollow quiet. Driven by an invisible current of fate, she set out into the unknown, transforming from a fragile echo into something living, something divine. As she drifted into the Aegean waters, her mortal frame blossomed into a breathtaking, youthful beauty, yet she remained completely unaware of her own volatile, immortal nature. Every attempt to seek companionship ended in tragic isolation. Sirens fled in terror at her mere presence, and the wild ocean creatures could never soothe the deep aching in her soul. In a sudden fit of bitter frustration, her thrashing limbs sent violent, destructive waves surging across the waterways, threatening to swallow every mortal vessel in a catastrophic storm. Then, like planets aligning in the dark velvet of space, destiny struck without warning. A blinding crimson streak ripped through the darkening sky, crashing onto the rocky shore of a distant island with a deafening, earth-shattering roar. While the frightened islanders cried out that a star had fallen from the heavens, the sea maiden knew better. Through the smoke and fire, she glimpsed a distinctly human shape plummeting toward the earth. Guided by an irresistible, magnetic pull, she waded through the hidden shallows, her delicate feet stepping onto the scorching, smoke-choked stones. Amidst the smoldering ash, she found the fallen stranger lying still upon a wide rock, a young male with hair as dark as a starless night. His face and limbs were marred by dark, crimson streams of blood. A broken, shattered soul cast out from the high heavens, marked by the same deep, tragic isolation that had defined her own existence. The pungent, metallic tang of fresh blood hung heavy in the smoke-choked air, a scent that would normally drive the sea maiden away in sheer revulsion. Yet an irresistible, inexplicable gravity held her spellbound above the broken boy. Blood had dried into dark, jagged crusts over his brow, framing a face twisted in silent agony. As he stirred in pain, His bruised body slipped toward the edge of the jagged rock. Panicked, the maiden abandoned all hesitation, throwing her weight over him and pressing her chest against his to pin him safely to the stone. The sudden impact brought her face inches from his, locking her into the gaze of a pair of eyes unlike anything in the realm. Deep gray, like storm-tossed seas, yet burning underneath with the mesmerizing, rhythmic pulse of dark crimson fire. Within those fiery depths lay the quiet birth and catastrophic death of entire worlds, a silent history that entranced the maiden born of ancient void. He broke the silence first, his voice gravelly as he asked if she was a spirit of the sea, a nereid or a siren. But having lived in total isolation, she had no names for the creatures of the world, let alone a name for herself. To hide her sudden embarrassment, she snapped back with playful defiance, demanding to be the one asking the questions instead. The boy merely offered a weary, knowing nod, permitting her indulgence. He possessed the uncanny ability to discern pure intent from malice, a skill forged through a lifetime of quiet rejection and betrayal. For this was the outcast prince of the High Realm, born of the Queen Mother alone, without the king's seed. In the ancient order, such a birth carried divine promise, yet he was treated as a curse, avoided and discarded. His own mother hid behind excuses, refusing to look upon him, while lesser courtly servants offered thin smiles laced with subtle condescension, sending him away into the cold shadows. Leaving the Mother Queen's hall, the outcast prince walked into the bitter cold of total rejection. The minor spirits and house nymphs laughed behind their hands, their quiet snickers echoing through the marble corridors like the hiss of serpents. Yet the smith did not react, accustomed to carrying his shame in absolute silence. Clutched tightly in his calloused hand was a small velvet pouch holding a delicate silver bracelet, forged with painstaking care as an offering for his mother. He had not sought an audience, nor had he hoped for a soft word, only to leave a token of his quiet devotion. Yet the doors were barred, the underlings acting on the explicit, cruel orders of the queen herself. He knew that cold, disgusted expression she wore whenever her eyes fell upon him, a look that pierced his soul deeper than any blade. Suddenly, a jagged rock tore through the quiet air, striking his forehead with a sickening thud. Dizziness washed over him as a thick, crimson stream trickled past his brow, obscuring his vision. Through the red haze, he saw the golden child of Olympus, the younger prince born of royal seed. The young war god approached with an arrogant sneer, his striking features an uncanny, beautiful mirror of their mother's, yet twisted with childish malice. Irritated that the stone had failed to drop the hulking youth, the favorite son demanded the outcast drop to his knees, spitting insults at his quiet demeanor and limping gait. Their mother had lavished every luxury upon her younger child, feeding him divine elixirs and holding him in her warm embrace, while the older prince was abandoned to the cold care of minor spirits. The Golden Prince bragged of his royal father, entirely unaware of the tragic secret, that it was the Queen Mother herself who had stripped the older son of his heritage, forbidding the king from ever acknowledging him. Pain and hot blood dripped down his face, blurring the boundary of his endless patience. Reaching out with a hand hardened by the forge, the smith grabbed the arrogant youth by the collar, twisting the fine fabric and looking down into his widening eyes. In a low, dark whisper that rattled the golden child to his core, he demanded a long-overdue apology, revealing for the very first time the terrifying, dormant storm brewing beneath his stoic silence. The young war god spat venomous threats, promising to unleash their royal mother's terrifying wrath if the blacksmith did not release him immediately. The memory of that mother's cruel hand burned inside the outcast's mind, remembering how she had once punished him severely, simply because her favorite son tripped and cried during a petty quarrel. That beating had broken his heart far more than his fragile body, leaving an invisible scar that never truly healed. Sensing the futility of seeking genuine warmth from his own blood, the blacksmith unclenched his calloused fist, turning his back to walk away in silent, heavy dignity. But the Golden Prince, consumed by unbridled rage, threw himself to the marble floor in a theatrical tantrum. Unsheathing his divine power in total defiance of realm laws, The childish god summoned terrifying dark spirits of slaughter and destruction. With a chilling, malicious grin, the young warlord commanded the shadowy specters to seize his older brother, dragging him directly toward the treacherous chasm at the edge of the realm. It was a forbidden boundary where chaotic, dimensional energies surged, a lethal vortex where unawakened gods could be erased from existence. Desperate cries echoed through the empty sky as the blacksmith fought against the phantom grip, yet the dark spirits obeyed their master's heartless command, pitching him headfirst into the abyss. Ripped through space and dimensional boundaries, his body plummeted toward the mortal plane, bathed in a streak of dark crimson fire. The catastrophic energy of his fall scorched the rocky earth of a lonely island, igniting wild forest fires and birthing a smoldering volcano in a single, violent impact. When the broken prince finally dragged his consciousness back from the brink of oblivion, he believed he had crossed into the underworld. Standing above his bruised, bloody frame, bathed in the quiet sea mist, was a vision of such staggering, peerless perfection that it defied divine comprehension. In a realm filled with exquisite goddesses and graceful spirits, this ethereal maiden burned brighter than anything he had ever known, making all of high heaven seem dim, gray, and utterly lifeless in comparison. Lying amid the smoking embers of the sea-swept rocks, the fallen smith stared up at the ethereal maiden, mesmerized by the quiet, expectant glow in her deep blue eyes. Never in his entire existence had anyone looked upon him with such tender, untainted curiosity. On the high peak of his homeland, he was merely an eyesore, a forgotten mistake cast aside by a cold mother and mocked by a cruel court. His name was always spat like a bitter curse, or heavy with scathing disdain. Yet, as she leaned closer, her voice soft as the ocean breeze, she asked who he was with genuine, unforced wonder. Stammering through his own profound disbelief, he whispered his name into the stillness. When those soft lips repeated the word, a strange, intoxicating warmth bloomed in his chest, stripped of shame, stripped of bitterness. It was the very first time his name had ever felt like a gift rather than a burden. Having no name, no heritage, and no sanctuary of her own, the maiden looked to him with quiet boldness, asking him to grant her an identity and a place to belong. The request terrified him. How could an outcast, a god denied every right since birth, possess the authority to name a divine being? Yet, she merely laughed at his heavy, melancholic logic, dismissing the need for grand divine rights. For her, it was simply a choice between two souls on a quiet shore. Moved by her unyielding spirit, he promised to craft a name worthy of her peerless essence, one that would echo through eternity. He offered her the smoldering island as a refuge, hesitant and stumbling over his words, fearful that she might reject him as everyone else had. Misinterpreting his awkward hesitation as reluctance, her eyes flashed with sharp annoyance, demanding a simple, honest truth, whether he truly desired her presence beside him. As the quiet sea mist swirled around them, holding its breath in the heavy silence, the outcast prince stood at the edge of a new destiny, torn between his deep-seated fear of rejection and the irresistible pull of the only creature who had ever truly seen him. Surrounded by the heavy, suffocating silence of his past, the blacksmith stood frozen, like a child who had never learned how to speak the truth of his own heart. In a realm where every honest word had been met with cold cruelty and bitter rejection, silence had become his only defense. He longed for her to stay, yet his wounded spirit felt too crippled to put that burning desire into words. Misinterpreting his silent struggle, the maiden turned away, stepping toward the desolate shore. Panic surged through him, a desperate dread of losing the only light that had ever broken through his dark world. Throwing aside his fear, he ran after her, kicking up coarse gravel, and grabbed the edge of her sleeve, his trembling fingers clutching the fabric as if holding onto life itself. A soft, amused smile touched her lips. Turning back, she placed her warm, white palms against his flushed copper cheeks, looking directly into his anxious eyes. With gentle authority, she made him promise to speak his mind without fear, urging him to let his true feelings breathe. In that quiet, intimate moment on the barren shore, a solemn pact was forged, two outcast souls bound together in a world that neither truly understood. Seeking refuge far from mortal eyes, they made their home deep within the fiery heart of a living volcano, Mount Olympus. The ancient earth spirits bowed in quiet reverence before the unawakened divine beings, crafting a secluded sanctuary within the subterranean heat where no mortal would ever dare to intrude. For the first time in his existence, the blacksmith felt the genuine warmth of belonging. The maiden spent her days following him into the glowing darkness of his forge, her endless curiosity breathing life into the quiet workshop. Though the intricate tools and metalwork meant little to her, he patiently answered every question, his own voice sounding lighter, richer, and more alive than it ever had. In her presence, the heavy chains of his past melted away, replaced by an unfamiliar, radiant peace. When she worried that her lack of interest in his craft might disappoint him, he gently reassured her, teaching her that individuality was something to be cherished, not suppressed. Tinkering with crude metals, his mind secretly painted visions of magnificent treasures, delicate anklets, luminous belts, and shimmering jewelry woven from moonbeams and starlight. He refused to settle for common copper or gold, holding out for materials worthy of her peerless grace, creating only trial trinkets until he could forge a masterpiece truly fitting for the goddess who had given him a reason to live. With a playful wink, the maiden stepped out into the sunlit breeze, leaving the young smith to his glowing forge. But his quiet focus was shattered moments later by a sudden, unnatural rumble of thunder. The fabric of space tore open at the foot of Mount Olympus, revealing a detachment of heavily armored soldiers clad in imperial divine steel. The commander stepped forward, declaring they had been sent to escort the young god back to high heaven. Months ago, the outcast would have complied without a word, indifferent to where his lonely existence dragged him. But now, everything had changed. Deep within the volcanic heart of the island, he had built a fragile home, and a soul he cherished would be left completely alone. Steeling his heart, he met the commander's gaze with a cold, dangerous intensity, refusing to return. Surprised by the outcast's sudden defiance, the commander admitted his orders were simply to bring him back, confirming the command had come directly from the king of the gods. A bitter pang of disappointment struck the smith, knowing his mother remained completely indifferent to his fate, yet relief followed. Knowing he could reason with the king far better than with the queen, firmly, the blacksmith delivered a final declaration, requesting to remain on the island for the rest of his days, isolated from high heaven, asking only that the divine court pretend he never existed. As the soldiers vanished into the ether, he sank to the ground, realizing he had clenched his fists so hard that his nails had drawn blood. When the maiden returned, carrying the salty scent of the sea breeze, she found him trembling in silent turmoil. The thought of high heaven discovering her existence, of his mother tearing away the only companion who had ever brought him joy, filled him with pure terror. Overwhelmed by emotion, tears spilled down his face as he threw his arms around her, desperately whispering his desire to stay beside her forever, until the very end of the world. Gentle laughter brushed against his ear as she wrapped her arms around his trembling frame, accepting his plea without hesitation, making him promise to watch the end of time by her side. Two young gods forged a quiet, sacred pact, bound not by ancient oaths or terrifying river curses, but by pure, innocent devotion, completely unaware of the dark shadows gathering on the horizon. The fragile illusion of peace did not last long. A storm swept over Mount Olympus, bringing with it a presence colder and far more terrifying than the army of heaven. It was the Queen Mother herself, descending to the mortal realm, not out of maternal concern for her discarded son, but to shield her favored child from divine justice. The king had uncovered the truth of the young war god's treason, and now, the queen demanded the blacksmith return to the high court and utter a grotesque lie, pleading that the incident had been a mere misunderstanding. For the first time in his existence, the smith felt no longing, no desperation for her approval. Listening to her cold demands, he felt a bizarre sense of liberation, laughter bubbling up from his chest as the final chains of yearning snapped. He refused her, declaring he would never cover for the golden child's cruelty. The Queen Mother's face twisted into a terrifying rage, a sight that had once paralyzed him with fear, yet now met only his quiet defiance. Realizing she could not manipulate him, she bound his limbs with invisible, inescapable chains of absolute divine force, suppressing his voice with ancient magic. Stripped of his autonomy, the broken prince was dragged into her grand golden carriage, as divine cloud horses tore through the sky, racing back toward the high realm. He fought against his bindings in complete, soundless despair, his silent screams swallowed by the rushing wind, thinking only of the maiden he was leaving behind. When the sea maiden returned from the shore, she was met with a suffocating, hollow silence. The volcanic forge, once filled with warmth and the rhythmic sound of his hammer, felt desolate and cold. Seeking out the local earth spirits, she learned of the Queen Mother's terrifying raid, yet the terrified spirits refused to speak his destination, paralyzed by the threat of divine retribution. Desperate and abandoned, she wandered the island from edge to edge, her delicate feet dragging across the coarse, sunburnt sand until her strength gave out. Dropping to the shore where they had first spoken, she stared out into the endless, silent horizon, remembering his gentle smile and the sacred promise they had made, completely unaware of how deep into the shadows of heaven he had been dragged. On the desolate shore, tears of profound, unfamiliar grief spilled from the maiden's eyes, hardening into glistening pearls as they struck the cool sand. Each tear held the heavy weight of an abandoned soul, swept away by the rhythmic cadence of the ocean waves. For the first time since her birth from the ancient primordial foam, an overwhelming tide of solitude crashed over her, leaving her shuddering in the cold sea breeze. Out of the eerie, shadow-draped skies, three ominous entities descended, the Erinyes, ancient sisters born of blood and vengeance. Beneath their hollow words of sympathy lay a predatory hunger, recognizing the girl as the final, uncorrupted essence of the Sky Father, possessing a dormant power capable of toppling divine thrones. They sought to feast upon her divine soul, hoping her grief would make her easy prey. With sinister intent disguised as sisterly affection, the dark furies whispered poison into the air, mocking the concept of trust and declaring that mortal and divine men always abandon those who love them. Yet despite her naivety, the maiden held firm, her stubborn heart refusing to believe the blacksmith had willingly broken his word. She declared her resolve to search the vast earth until the truth was laid bare. Realizing they could not harvest her power by physical force without violating the sacred laws of nature, the sisters wove a web of deceit. As the maiden sought refuge within her luminous, coral-hard cradle bubble, the Furies unleashed a subtle, mind-clouding miasma. The sweet, suffocating haze dulled her sharp mind, stirring dark, unnatural doubts about time, memory, and the fragility of promises. Cornered by psychological manipulation, the hazy-minded maiden accepted a treacherous, uneven wager. Swearing to seek out her lost companion against all odds, she unknowingly bound her fate to the Dark Sisters. Should she fail to find him, or should his memory of her fade into obscurity, her body and soul would belong to the abyss. With a cruel, silent curse, the Furies sealed away her precious memories, wiping clean every warm afternoon in the volcanic forge, every shared smile, and the very name of the prince who had cherished her. Left with only an insatiable, nameless yearning hollowed into her chest, the maiden floated out into the endless ocean, completely oblivious to the dark web closing around her divine destiny. The long-sealed dam of forgotten centuries shattered in a single, suffocating heartbeat as the maiden opened her eyes to the crimson reality of the present. Overwhelmed by a sudden, violent flood of restored memories, her mind reeled while her chest heaved with uncontrollable sobs. Across the blood-stained stone, the arrogant war god roared with childish fury, his deadly strike having missed its mark, yet the battered blacksmith paid his enraged brother no mind. Ignoring his own dripping wounds, the smith surged forward, effortlessly crushing the war god beneath a massive boulder with a single, practiced sweep of his arm, holding the golden child in place like a minor nuisance. He rushed to the maiden's side, his rugged face etched with pure, selfless concern, softly wrapping a warm cloth around her trembling shoulders, completely blind to everything else in existence except her comfort. Looking into those deep, familiar gray eyes, the maiden saw past the broad, scarred frame of the master smith to the gentle outcast boy she had met on the volcanic shore so long ago. The agonizing weight of realization crushed her spirit, remembering how he had patiently stood by her side in this cold court, trying to rebuild a bond she had forgotten, while she had blindly pushed him away. Grasping his shirt with trembling fists, her voice cracked through her tears, demanding to know why he had abandoned her on the volcanic island without a word. Confused for a fleeting second, the blacksmith stared back until the truth dawned upon him, realizing that the lost memory of their youth had finally returned to her. As her soft, exhausted blows landed harmlessly against his chest, the smith offered no defense, accepting her sorrow, her anger, and her long-buried yearning. Pulling her tightly into his powerful embrace, he held her close against the cold mountain wind, silently renewing the sacred promise forged in their youth, never again to let the shadows of high heaven tear them apart. Entwined within the quiet sanctuary of his chamber, bathed in the muted, amber glow of the hearth, the two gods lay wrapped in each other's arms. The heavy air was thick with ancient longing and the unspoken pain of lost centuries. As he stroked her hair with gentle, calloused fingers, the blacksmith revealed how he had returned to the abandoned volcanic shores after his forced testimony, searching endlessly for her, only to discover from the timid earth spirits that she had been ensnared by the deceitful Furies. It was never merely a game of physical distance. The treacherous wager imposed by the Sisters of Vengeance had locked away her soul, demanding that her heart return to him entirely before the ancient veil over her mind could drop. Burying her face against his broad chest, she felt a quiet sting of shame for the years she had spent pushing him away, unaware that his patient, melancholic presence had been holding the shadows of high heaven at bay all along. Between soft, lingering touches and the quiet warmth of his embrace, he confessed the long-hidden truth of his mother's endless cruelty. How the queen of the high court had restricted his very freedom for years, forcing him to shield his ruthless brother until he finally matured into his full divine strength. The maiden raged against the injustice, her fierce loyalty flaring like wildfire. Yet as she breathed in the earthy scent of smoke and iron clinging to his skin, her anger dissolved into a deep, irresistible intimacy. Her playful affection sent a sharp surge through the quiet room, driving the heavy gloom away and leaving the master smith breathless, desperate to hold back his own overwhelming desire, so he could reveal the final, haunting secret. Holding her firmly against him to still her distracting warmth, he whispered the dark, psychological core of his mother's lifelong hatred. The cold disdain, the relentless disgust, and the bitter rejections that had haunted him since birth were not born of a mere flaw, but of a terrifying resemblance. In his features, the queen saw the unmistakable, haunting shadow of the Titan king himself, Kronos, a living reminder of the dark past high heaven fought so desperately to forget. The dark, psychological rot behind the Queen Mother's relentless disdain was finally laid bare. It was not a simple flaw or a divine whim that made her cast her own blood into the abyss, but a terrifying, inescapable resemblance. In the quiet, rugged features of the Master Smith, she saw the undeniable phantom of the Titan King himself, Kronos, a tyrant who had once devoured his own lineage out of paranoid greed. Every look at her discarded child forced the queen to relive the horrifying trauma of the past. Her shame, her deep-seated fear, and her hatred were projected entirely onto the innocent young boy, making him a silent scapegoat for high heaven's darkest memory. Hearing this, the sea-born maiden boiled with sharp, defensive fury, mocking the absurdity of holding a child accountable for the bloodline he never chose. Yet beneath his calm acceptance, the smith carried an agonizing, lifelong insecurity. Feeling unworthy of the goddess whose radiant grace eclipsed the heavens, he confessed the desperate gamble he had taken when rumors of her marriage first spread. Terror-stricken by the thought of losing her forever, He had secretly approached the king of gods, offering an unyielding bargain to secure her hand. Ashamed of his desperate maneuvering, he bowed his head, fully expecting her anger, and offering to release her from their sacred bond if she so desired. But the maiden saw through his guilt, recognizing the profound, tragic vulnerability of a man who had only ever known abandonment. She made him promise never to hide the truth again, sealing their unspoken vow with a fierce, possessive resolve. Overturning his hesitant doubts, she pinned him beneath her, using raw, irresistible desire to shatter every shadow of inadequacy still lingering in his mind. In the deep, heavy stillness of the chamber, words dissolved into breath and burning heat as she showed him, with slow, hypnotic intimacy, that the outcast prince was the only soul who could ever truly possess her heart. In the tangled silence of the chamber, the lingering shadows of past grief dissolved into an intense, feverish warmth. The maiden's fierce, protective devotion shattered the last remnants of the smith's lifelong doubts. Leaving his rugged hands to cradle her soft, trembling frame as his deep laughter echoed against the stone walls, a rare, unrestrained sound of pure, liberated joy. Yet outside their secluded sanctuary, news of the divine skirmish had already torn through the high realm like wildfire, thanks to the swift, gossiping wind of the messenger god. By the time the two emerged, bathed in a quiet, newfound unity, the Supreme Council had gathered en masse upon their threshold, led by the King of the Sky himself, offering grand, strained pleasantries to mask the underlying tension. The maiden offered only a sharp, sarcastic smile in return, mocking the Grand Court's sudden concern for courtesy when their golden war god had so casually breached her home. But while the Sky King attempted to maintain a diplomatic facade, the Queen Mother erupted in furious desperation, demanding the immediate release of her favored son, who still lay humiliatingly pinned beneath the smith's massive boulder. Her dramatic weeping over her precious child's imagined injuries drew stifled laughter from the shadowy ranks of the gathered deities, none of whom harbored any love for the brutal god of war. Unbothered by the queen's thunderous rage, the maiden stepped forward with radiant, lethal grace, placing herself firmly between the divine monarch and the husband she had sworn to protect. With chilling composure, she declared that the sanctuary belonged solely to the master smith, demanding that the Queen Mother adopt a tone of humble respect if she wished to negotiate for the intruder's release. When the outcast prince tried to quiet her, she silenced him with an unyielding glare, insisting that an unprovoked attack on a fellow divine soul demanded a formal, uncompromising trial. Exposing the lingering blood on the blacksmith's forehead to the entire divine assembly, she laid bare the war god's treasonous intent to murder his own brother. A shocked silence fell over the gathered gods as the heavy evidence sank in, leaving the Supreme King stunned and the Queen Mother trapped in her own web of arrogance, as the stage was set for a divine reckoning that high heaven could no longer sweep beneath the rug. The heavy, suffocating silence hanging over the divine threshold shattered as the sea-born maiden laid down her ultimatum, demanding an unyielding, uncoerced trial for the war god's bloody treason. Her sharp, penetrating gaze locked onto the Queen Mother, silently threatening to lay bare every dark manipulation and forced secret before the High King's open court. Trapped between public exposure and the humiliating spectacle of her favorite son pinned beneath the master smith's heavy stone, the Queen's regal composure buckled. For the first time in recorded memory, the proud mother of high heaven bowed her head, her voice trembling as she swallowed her venom and formally begged the discarded blacksmith for mercy, asking forgiveness on behalf of her foolish, violent child. At that moment, the heavy, invisible chains that had bound the smith's soul since his bitter birth snapped completely. A lifetime of quiet, buried agony escaped his lungs in a single, cathartic breath. Standing tall beside the woman who had fought for his dignity, he granted the cold release, yet firmly maintained that high heaven would still deliver formal justice, refusing to ever let his sanctuary be violated again. Feeling lighter than the ethereal clouds beneath his feet, the master smith pulled his beloved into a deep, desperate embrace before the silent, astounded gods, whispering his profound, raw devotion against her ear. The frantic, racing rhythm of her heart against his chest was the only answer he would ever need, confirming that the painful solitude of his past was forever over. In the lingering heat of the quiet days that followed, the blacksmith's private chambers became a world unto themselves, bathed in warm, heavy condensation and the sweet, lingering essence of absolute surrender. Entwined together away from the cold politics of the mountain, the two lovers lost all sense of divine restraint. Through endless, breathless afternoons, the former outcast held his radiant bride in a state of suspended, agonizing ecstasy, testing the limits of her endurance with slow, deliberate tenderness. Ignoring her soft, needy pleas to end the torment, his calloused hands guided her through a labyrinth of overwhelming sensation, keeping the ultimate release tantalizingly out of reach until her very soul was completely wide open to him. Every breath, every shuddering gasp, and every clenching touch bound them tighter than any ancient law or forced decree, proving that the forgotten prince had not only conquered the lingering shadows of his past, but had forever captured the wild, unyielding heart of the goddess of love herself. Bound by delicate golden links forged in a hearth, the sea-born maiden found herself held in absolute, agonizing stillness. The subtle restraint was not a punishment, but a deliberate surrender to the blacksmith's quiet, complex desires. A soul raised in isolation and neglected shadows had developed his own intricate rituals of devotion, using finely crafted instruments to heighten every shiver of sensation across her skin. Though teased by the delicate weight of his golden creations and the tantalizing delay of his touch, her patience wore thin. Through trembling gasps and heavy, humid air, she made it clear that no gilded trinket could ever compare to the raw, unmediated warmth of his body. Sensing his subtle hesitation, she gently coaxed the truth from his lips, discovering that his obsession with her yearning was merely a reflection of his deepest, lingering fear of losing her again. Shattering the last delicate barrier between them with a simple spell, the master smith discarded the chains and gathered her into his powerful embrace. In the quiet sanctuary of their chamber, time dissolved as they surrendered completely to each other, no longer divided by lingering doubts, divine decrees, or the painful shadows of their past. When the duties of the high realm eventually called them back to their respective thrones, a new sense of peace settled over the volcanic halls. Though the blacksmith confessed his desperate reluctance to part from her side even for a single afternoon, the maiden reassured him with a soft, knowing smile, reminding him of the eternal oath they had forged together. Holding his face in her hands, she whispered 3 simple words that eclipsed all the divine grandeur of Mount Olympus, a timeless declaration that anchored their souls for eternity. The outcast prince who had once known only cold abandonment had finally found his home, chosen completely and unconditionally by the goddess of love herself. Long before the majestic golden halls of high heaven ever graced the peaks, a forgotten fragment of a fallen primordial sky king drifted endlessly across the restless ocean waves. For centuries, the white, incandescent foam floated like a spirit without an anchor, ignored by the supreme king of the sky and dismissed by the lord of the deep ocean, who grew weary of guarding something that refused to awaken. As the cosmic order shifted and the primordial realm faded into distant memory, the mysterious crest swept silently through the inland waters, wandering past isolated shores as if searching for a long-lost soul. Yet finding no place to anchor, the ethereal foam retreated back into the swift, dark currents, carrying its divine secret into the open sea. Then came the moment of supreme genesis. As the waves broke upon the isolated sandbanks of Cyprus, a violent shockwave of raw, creative energy erupted into the heavens, dyeing the skies in brilliant, impossible light and shattering the tranquil feast of the divine court. Driven by raw instinct and wild intrigue, the supreme rulers descended upon the earth in an overwhelming tide of presence, nearly suffocating the native spirits and land beneath their crushing weight. Through the suffocating tension, a voice of sublime, melodic resonance echoed across the tide, effortlessly pushing back the oppressive aura of the gods. Stripped of their breath, The assembled deities watched as the goddess of wisdom brought forth a being newly born from the depths. She was an absolute revelation. Ethereal golden hair cascaded over her shoulders like sunlight on water, framing sea gem eyes that held the mystery of endless abysses beneath long, delicate lashes. Wrapped in a simple cloak, her mere presence possessed a hypnotic, blinding enchantment that froze the divine court in stunned, breathless silence. Scanning the crowd with a deep, unspoken yearning, her radiant gaze searched the silent gods for a face she could not yet name. Disappointed by what she saw, her eyes fell to the earth beneath her feet, causing the very ground to flush with shame and burst into wild, crimson roses. Recognizing the undeniable force of her existence, the King of Heaven bestowed upon her the final sovereign title of the divine pantheon, naming her the absolute standard of beauty and desire. Aphrodite.